Snow blinded Eleanor Hayes as she knelt in the biting cold, clutching two newborn infants against her chest. The howling wind threatened to tear the babies from her arms, but she held them close, her body curved protectively around their tiny forms. Her lips were blue, her fingers numb, but still she whispered the same words over and over. I promised you, Rebecca, I won't let these children die. The blizzard had intensified in the last hour, transforming the Rocky Mountain Pass into a white hell that threatened to bury them all. Behind her, the covered wagons of their train were barely visible ghostly shapes in the swirling maelstrom. Somewhere men were shouting, but their voices were swept away by the wind. Eleanor looked down at the infants, just 3 weeks old, their faces red from the cold, despite the layers of blankets she had wrapped them in. They shouldn't be out here. No one should. But she had no choice. As consciousness began to slip away, Eleanor's mind drifted back to where it had all begun 6 months earlier, in the place she once called home. St. Louis, Missouri. April 4. The oak tree in the backyard had witnessed 17 years of Eleanor's life. It had seen her arrive as a hopeful bride at 19, had shaded her during long summer afternoons as she read medical journals borrowed from the town doctor, and had stood sentinel through 15 years of silent disappointment each time her monthly courses arrived with cruel punctuality. Now, at 34, Eleanor knelt beneath its branches one last time, a small hole dug in the soft spring earth before her. In her palm lay her wedding ring, gold, catching the morning light. She stared at it for a long moment, then placed it gently in the hole and covered it with soil. Goodbye, Jonathan, she whispered, patting the earth flat. I can't carry you where I'm going. The house behind her was empty, now its contents sold or packed for the journey west. The deed had been signed over to Dr. Abernathy, who had taught Eleanor most of what she knew about medicine. A fair trade, she thought. The house where she had known so much loneliness in exchange for the letter of recommendation folded carefully in her travel bag. As she rose to leave, her foot knocked against a small wooden box she hadn't noticed. The lid came loose, spilling a handful of papers onto the ground. Eleanor recognized Jonathan's handwriting immediately. His journal, which she thought she had packed away. She picked up the scattered pages, intending to replace them, when a particular entry caught her eye. The date was from 4 years ago, while Jonathan was away fighting in Mexico. April 17th, 1845. The child that Eleanor never knew existed. May God forgive me for keeping it from her. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the words again. Child. What child? She frantically searched through the other pages but found no further explanation. Her head spun with questions. Had she been pregnant without knowing? Had Jonathan kept some terrible secret all these years? But he had died of consumption 18 months ago, taking whatever truth he knew to his grave. Eleanor pressed the journal to her chest, a hollow ache spreading through her. One more unanswered question to carry west. The hill overlooking Independence, Missouri provided Eleanor with her first glimpse of the wagon train that would carry her to Oregon Territory. Dozens of covered wagons were arranged in a loose circle on the flat land below, surrounded by the chaos of preparation. Men shouted as they checked wagon wheels and axles. Women organized supplies and calmed excited children. Oxen and mules waited patiently in their traces. Eleanor stood apart from it all, observing. The letter from Dr. Abernathy felt heavy in her pocket. It was her passport to this new life, the certification of her medical knowledge that might make her useful to these travelers despite being a woman alone. Quite a sight, isn't it? Eleanor turned to find an elderly woman standing beside her, leaning on a walking stick. Her face was deeply lined, but her eyes were sharp and assessing. My fourth crossing, the woman continued, her accent marking her as German. I go back and forth helping families settle. I am Mrs. Schmidt. Eleanor Hayes, she replied, extending her hand. This is my first journey. Mrs. Schmidt's handshake was surprisingly firm. You travel alone, no husband, no family. My husband died last year. We had no children. The words still stung, even after all this time. The older woman studied her with those penetrating eyes. So why go west, Mrs. Hayes? What does Oregon hold for you that St. Louis does not? Eleanor looked back at the bustling camp. In the distance, a young mother cradled an infant while directing her older children in some task. The familiar ache bloomed in Eleanor's chest. A fresh start, she said simply. In St. Louis, I'm the woman who couldn't have children, the pitied widow. Out there, perhaps I can be something else. Mrs. Schmidt nodded slowly. The frontier has a way of remaking people. She gestured toward the camp with her walking stick. Come, I will introduce you to Captain Morgan. He leads this train. As they descended the hill, Eleanor watched a group of children playing near the creek that ran alongside the camp. They splashed in the shallows, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. Mothers washed clothes on the banks, calling occasional warnings to their little ones. One woman knelt in the water, gently bathing a toddler who squirmed and giggled. Eleanor paused, momentarily transfixed. The scene was so ordinary, yet to her impossibly distant, a life she had yearned for but never known. Mrs. Schmidt noticed her hesitation. It is hard, yes, to see what others have that you do not. I've had 15 years to grow accustomed to it. Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the tightness in her throat. But yes, sometimes it catches me unaware. The old woman's face softened. The journey changes us all, Mrs. Hayes. Who knows what awaits you in Oregon? They continued toward the camp, but the image stayed with Eleanor. Mothers and children by the stream, sunlight on water, the easy intimacy of family life. She felt, as she always did in such moments, a stranger looking through a window at a warm room she could never enter. Captain Frederick Morgan was not what Eleanor had expected. Barely 30, he had the weathered look of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors, but his eyes held an intelligence that immediately put her on guard. This was not a man easily fooled or won over. A woman traveling alone. He frowned at Mrs. Schmidt, then at Eleanor. The trail is no place for unaccompanied females, especially one with no frontier experience. They stood outside Morgan's wagon, which was larger than most, and marked with a small flag to designate it as belonging to the train's leader. His skepticism was palpable. I have skills that might be useful, Eleanor said, handing him Dr. Abernathy's letter. I've trained in medicine for over a decade. Morgan scanned the letter, his eyebrows rising slightly. Midwifery, too. Yes, I've delivered 17 babies. Eleanor didn't mention that it had always been bittersweet work, helping other women bring forth the children she could never have. Before Morgan could respond, a young woman emerged from the wagon behind him. She was perhaps 25, with a kind face and golden hair braided simply down her back. Most striking was her advanced pregnancy, her belly round and prominent beneath her dress. Frederick, who are you interrogating now? Her voice was light, teasing. Morgan's face transformed instantly, softening into a smile. Rebecca, you should be resting. Rebecca Morgan ignored her husband's concerns, stepping forward to extend her hand to Eleanor. I'm Rebecca, and you are Eleanor Hayes. I'm hoping to join the wagon train. Rebecca's smile widened. A new face, wonderful. Are you traveling with family? I'm alone, Eleanor said. My husband passed last year. I'm so sorry. Rebecca's sympathy seemed genuine without the pity Eleanor had grown to resent. But you're welcome here. Aren't you going to tell her yes, Frederick? Morgan looked torn between exasperation and affection. Rebecca, I can't make exceptions just because Mrs. Hayes has medical training, Mrs. Schmidt interrupted, including midwifery. Rebecca's eyes lit up. A midwife. Oh, Frederick, it's Providence. She placed a protective hand on her belly. I've been so worried about, well, when the time comes. Eleanor saw the moment Captain Morgan's resistance crumbled. Whatever concerns he had about an unaccompanied woman on the trail, they couldn't stand against his wife's obvious delight. We leave in 3 days, he said gruffly. If you can be ready by then, you can join us. But I warn you, Mrs. Hayes, this journey is not for the faint of heart. I understand, Eleanor replied, and thank you. As Frederick turned to help another traveler, Rebecca linked her arm through Eleanor's. Come meet the others, and you must tell me all about your medical experience. I'm due sometime after we reach Oregon, but babies aren't known for respecting schedules. Eleanor allowed herself to be led into the camp, aware of a strange new feeling unfurling within her. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone needed her. Not just her skills, but her. It was a dangerous feeling to indulge, but as Rebecca chattered happily beside her, Eleanor couldn't quite suppress it. Hope, fragile and unwelcome, but undeniably there. The camp bustled with activity. As Eleanor made her way through it, Rebecca pointing out various families and explaining their connections. The wagon train consisted of 43 families, a diverse collection of people united only by their determination to reach Oregon Territory and the free land it promised. The Wells family has the largest wagon, Rebecca was saying. Harrison Wells made his fortune in shipping. That's his wife, Martha, by their fire, and their daughter, Lily. Eleanor followed Rebecca's gesture to where an elegantly dressed woman supervised a young girl's needlework. Even at this distance, the quality of their clothing marked them as wealthy. Most of us had to sell everything to afford this journey, Rebecca continued, but the Wells brought half their household with them. As they passed the Wells wagon, Harrison Wells himself emerged. He was a tall man with a carefully trimmed beard and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His gaze fell on them, lingering particularly on Eleanor. "Mrs. Morgan," he acknowledged with a nod. "And who might this be?" "Eleanor Hayes," Rebecca said. "She's joining our train. She has medical training." Wells raised an eyebrow. "Indeed, and you travel alone, Mrs. Hayes?" "I do." "How unusual." His tone made it clear this was not a compliment. "I do hope Captain Morgan has considered the additional burden an unaccompanied woman might place on our resources." Eleanor felt her spine stiffen. "I assure you, Mr. Wells, I have no intention of being a burden to anyone. Intentions and realities often differ, especially on the frontier." Wells smiled thinly. "If you'll excuse me, ladies." As he walked away, Rebecca squeezed Eleanor's arm. "Don't mind him. Harrison thinks the wagon train should be run like one of his shipping companies, with everyone ranked by usefulness." Eleanor watched Wells rejoin his family, noting how his daughter straightened her posture at his approach. Something in the girl's quick, anxious movement struck a chord of recognition in Eleanor. She had seen that same fearful deference in patients whose husbands or fathers ruled with iron hands. "What brought the Wells family west?" she asked. "They don't seem the type to need free land." A shadow crossed Rebecca's face. "They lost their sons, twin boys, to scarlet fever 2 years ago. Lily was the only one who survived. Martha told me they're hoping for a fresh start where the memories aren't so painful." Eleanor watched as Harrison corrected something in his daughter's needlework, the girl's face falling at his criticism. "Some ghosts follow you no matter how far you run," she murmured. Their tour continued with Rebecca introducing Eleanor to various families, the Millers with their 5 boisterous children, the Chen brothers who had left China for the California goldfields, but decided to try farming in Oregon instead, the Washburn sisters, spinsters, who planned to open a school in the new territory. "And that," Rebecca said, lowering her voice, "is Dr. Solomon Clark. He joined us in Independence, claiming to be a retired Army surgeon." Eleanor followed her gaze to where an older man with a shock of white hair was examining a young boy's arm. He wore a formal coat despite the warm weather, and his manner was pompous as he spoke to the boy's concerned mother. "Claiming rain?" Eleanor asked. Rebecca shrugged. "Frederick has his doubts. The man knows medical terminology, but something about him feels off." As they watched, Dr. Clark applied a foul-smelling poultice to the boy's arm. Even from a distance, Eleanor could tell it was far too tight. "That bandage will cut off circulation," she murmured. "You see, this is why we need you." Rebecca patted her hand. "Frederick allowed Clark to join us because we had no other medical help, but I'll feel much safer knowing you're here too." Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety. She hadn't anticipated competition in her role. If this Dr. Clark was legitimate, her own informal training might seem inadequate by comparison. Yet as she watched him strut away from his patient, leaving the too tight bandage in place, she felt her professional concern overshadowed her personal worries. "Excuse me," she said to Rebecca. "I should check on that boy." Rebecca smiled. "Go. I'll find you later. We have so much more to talk about." Eleanor made her way to the boy and his mother. Up close, she could see the child's fingers were already turning dusky from lack of blood flow. "Pardon me," she said, kneeling beside them. "I'm Eleanor Hayes. I have some medical training. May I look at your son's arm?" The mother looked uncertain. "But Dr. Clark, just please," Eleanor said gently. "I'm concerned about the tightness of that bandage." After a moment's hesitation, the woman nodded. Eleanor carefully unwound the bandage, revealing an angry red scrape beneath. "What happened?" she asked the boy. "Fell out of a tree," he mumbled. "Scraped it on the bark." Eleanor examined the wound. "It's not deep, but it needs cleaning. And this poultice," she sniffed it cautiously. "What did Dr. Clark say this was?" "Some special army remedy," the mother replied. He said it would prevent putrefaction. Eleanor recognized the sharp smell of turpentine and something else, possibly urine, an outdated treatment that would do more harm than good. I recommend we clean this with soap and water, then leave it open to the air, she said. If you're concerned about infection, a clean cloth soaked in diluted witch hazel would be better than this mixture. The mother looked torn, but Dr. Clark said, "Mother," the boy interrupted, "my fingers hurt and they look funny." Eleanor gently took his hand. "That's because the bandage was too tight. See how the color is returning now that I've removed it?" As pink slowly suffused the boy's fingers, his mother's expression changed from doubt to gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. I'll clean it as you suggested." Eleanor rose, aware that her small victory might have larger consequences. Contradicting Dr. Clark on her first day would not make her journey easier. But as she looked at the boy's arm now free of the dangerous bandage, she knew she had made the right choice. Medicine had been her solace after years of childlessness, the one area where her nurturing instincts could find expression. She would not compromise those principles, even in the wilderness. The clash came sooner than Eleanor expected. That evening, as families gathered around their fires for the night meal, Dr. Clark sought her out, his face flushed with indignation. "Mrs. Hayes," he said loudly enough for nearby families to hear, "I understand you took it upon yourself to undo my medical work today." Eleanor met his gaze calmly. "The bandage was restricting blood flow to the boy's fingers. I removed it for his safety." Clark drew himself up. "I am a doctor, madam, a graduate of Jefferson Medical College with 20 years of Army service. What precisely are your qualifications?" Several people had stopped eating to watch the confrontation. Eleanor felt their eyes on her, judging, assessing. "I trained under Dr. Thomas Abernathy in St. Louis for 12 years, she replied evenly. "I've assisted in surgeries, delivered babies, and treated everything from cholera to broken bones." "But no formal education," Clark pressed. "No degree, no commission. No, Dr. Clark, just practical experience and results." The doctor's lip curled. "Captain Morgan," he called to Frederick, who sat nearby, "did you know when you accepted this woman that she would undermine the only qualified physician on this expedition?" Frederick looked uncomfortable at being pulled into the dispute. "Dr. Clark, Mrs. Hayes." "I have a recommendation," Eleanor interrupted, pulling Dr. Abernathy's letter from her pocket. "And I'd be happy to demonstrate my knowledge any way you see fit." Clark scoffed. "A letter can be forged. As for demonstrations, I have no interest in amateur theatrics." "Then perhaps we should let our results speak for themselves," Eleanor suggested. "The care of our company's health is too important for personal disputes." Rebecca, who had been watching with concern, spoke up. "Eleanor is right. We're fortunate to have two people with medical knowledge. Surely there's room for both of you." Clark's face darkened, but with all eyes upon him, he could hardly continue his attack. "As you wish, Mrs. Morgan. But remember, when lives are at stake, experience and proper training matter." With a final glare at Eleanor, he stalked away. The tension broke, conversations resuming around the fires. Frederick gave Eleanor an appraising look before turning back to his meal. Rebecca offered an encouraging smile. Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The confrontation had established Clark as her adversary, but it had also made clear to everyone that there were now two medical options in the camp. Given Clark's questionable treatment of the boy, that could only be a good thing. Still, as she prepared her own simple meal at her small fire, Eleanor couldn't help but feel a wave of loneliness wash over her. Among 43 families, she alone sat by a fire with no one to share it. No husband to discuss the day, with no children to tend to. Just herself and the vast, darkening sky above. "May I join you?" Eleanor looked up to find Rebecca standing nearby, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Of course," Eleanor said, surprised. "But shouldn't you be with Frederick?" Rebecca lowered herself carefully onto the log beside Eleanor, one hand supporting her pregnant belly. "He's discussing the route with some of the men. Besides, I wanted to talk with you alone." There was something in her, a vulnerability that hadn't been there during their earlier conversations. Eleanor felt her medical instincts sharpen. "Is everything all right, the baby?" "The baby's fine, active, actually." Rebecca managed a small smile. "That's what I wanted to discuss. You've delivered babies before, you said." "Yes, 17. And Were there complications? Did any of the mothers? Rebecca trailed off, her hand moving protectively over her belly. Eleanor understood immediately. You're afraid. Rebecca nodded, tears suddenly welling in her eyes. I'm terrified, Eleanor. Giving birth out here so far from proper hospitals or help. My own mother died in childbirth. Her labor lasted 3 days. Eleanor took the younger woman's hand, feeling the slight tremor in it. Many women have delivered healthy babies on the trail, Rebecca, and I'll be with you when the time comes. Promise, Rebecca looked up, her fear naked and raw. Promise you'll be there, that you'll do everything you can. I promise, Eleanor said, meaning it more deeply than she had intended. Something about Rebecca's youth and vulnerability awakened a fierce protectiveness in her. Rebecca wiped her eyes. There's more. If something happens to me, if I don't survive, promise me you'll look after my baby. Eleanor stilled. Rebecca, Frederick would... Frederick is a good man, Rebecca interrupted, but he knows nothing about babies, and he'll be devastated if I'm gone. Please, Eleanor. I need to know that someone I trust will care for my child if I can't. The weight of what Rebecca was asking settled on Eleanor's shoulders. It was both an honor and a terrible burden. To be so trusted by a woman she had just met, to be asked to step into the void if the worst happened. I promise, Eleanor said finally, but it won't come to that. We'll get you safely to Oregon, and you'll raise your baby yourself. Rebecca squeezed her hand. Thank you. You can't know what it means to have you here. As they sat together in the growing darkness, Eleanor felt the strange new tendril of hope unfurl a little further. Not for herself. She had learned long ago not to hope for the impossible. But for Rebecca and her unborn child, she would hope. And she would do everything in her power to ensure that hope was not in vain. 3 days later, the wagon train departed Independence at dawn, a long procession of covered wagons stretching nearly half a mile. The mood was celebratory despite the early hour. Children ran alongside the wagons, too excited to ride. Women called to each other, sharing last-minute advice and encouragement. Men checked harnesses and wheels one final time. Eleanor's wagon was positioned near the middle of the train between the Washburn sisters and a family named Peterson with 2 young boys. Her preparations had been simpler than most. She traveled light with only her medical supplies, some books, clothing, and basic provisions. Her single team of oxen, purchased with the last of her savings, seemed healthy and steady. As her wagon jolted into motion following those ahead, Eleanor felt a curious lightness. For the first time in years, she was moving towards something, not just enduring where she was. The early days of the journey passed uneventfully as the wagon train made its way across the rolling hills of eastern Kansas. The weather was fair, the pace manageable. Each night they formed their wagons into a protective circle with livestock corralled in the center and campfires scattered throughout. Eleanor quickly established a routine. During the day, she walked alongside her wagon when possible, saving her oxen's strength. She used these walks to check on various families, particularly those with small children or elderly members who might need medical attention. In the evenings, after tending to any minor injuries or illnesses that had arisen during the day, she often found herself sharing meals with Rebecca and Frederick. Despite his initial reservations, the captain seemed to have accepted Eleanor's presence, particularly as her medical skills proved consistently useful. Clark, meanwhile, maintained a cool distance, though Eleanor occasionally caught him watching her with narrowed eyes. He had gathered a small circle of followers, particularly among the wealthier families like the Wells, who were impressed with his credentials and authoritative manner. It was during the second week of travel that the wagon train encountered another westbound group at a river crossing. A smaller party of 10 wagons led by a man named Gabriel Winters. Eleanor was helping Rebecca down from her wagon when the stranger approached them. He was tall and lean, with dark hair streaked with gray at the temples and eyes the color of a stormy sky. Something about him triggered a sense of recognition in Eleanor, though she was certain they had never met. Captain Morgan, the man greeted Frederick, who had come to assist his wife. Gabriel Winters, my party's been tracking your dust for the past 2 days. Frederick shook the offered hand. Heading to Oregon. That's the plan. We're a small group, mostly single men bound for the Willamette Valley. I was hoping we might join forces at least until we're past the mountains. As the men discussed arrangements, Eleanor found Winter's gaze shifting to her. The intensity of his scrutiny was unsettling. Have we met before, sir? She finally asked. A flicker of something, surprise alarm, crossed his face before it resumed its careful neutrality. I don't believe so, ma'am. I'd remember. Yet there was something in his voice, a careful precision to his denial that made Eleanor certain he was lying. Winters is a hunter and guide, Frederick explained to them. Says he's made the crossing twice before. 3 times, Winters corrected. And I know a shortcut through the mountains that could save us weeks. Critical time with winter approaching. Frederick looked interested. We should discuss this further. Join us for the evening meal. As the men walked away, Rebecca clutched Eleanor's arm. Did you see how he looked at you? Very mysterious? Eleanor shook her head. More unsettling than mysterious. There's something familiar about him, but I can't place it. Well, he's handsome in a weathered sort of way. Rebecca grinned. And single by the looks of him. Rebecca, Eleanor chided, but found herself smiling despite her unease. I have no interest in frontier romances. Yet later, as she organized her medical supplies in her wagon, Eleanor found her thoughts returning to Gabriel Winters and the strange sense of familiarity he evoked. Had they crossed paths somewhere before St. Louis was a busy river town? It was possible they had seen each other in passing, but that didn't explain the intensity of his gaze or the careful way he had denied knowing her. It was almost as if he had been expecting her, which was impossible. Eleanor pushed the thought aside. The journey ahead would be challenging enough without inventing mysteries where none existed. By the following evening, Gabriel Winters and his smaller party had been fully incorporated into the larger wagon train. The single men were assigned positions throughout the line, their additional rifles providing welcome security. Winters himself often rode ahead as a scout, his knowledge of the terrain proving immediately useful. At the evening camp, Eleanor was changing the dressing on a young girl's infected finger when she became aware of someone watching her. Looking up, she found Winters standing a few yards away. Can I help you, Mr. Winters? She asked, returning her attention to her patient. Just observing, he replied, moving closer. That's a neat technique with the bandaging. Eleanor finished wrapping the girl's finger. There you go, Sarah. Keep it clean and dry, and come see me tomorrow. As the child ran off to rejoin her family, Eleanor stood wiping her hands on her apron. Did you need medical attention, Mr. Winters? No. He seemed to struggle with what to say next. I heard you trained with Dr. Abernathy in St. Louis. Eleanor felt her suspicions sharpen. How did you know that Captain Morgan mentioned it? Winters' answer came too quickly. I've heard of Abernathy. Good reputation. Yes, he's an excellent physician. An awkward silence fell between them. Winters seemed on the verge of saying something more, then thought better of it. Well, good evening, Mrs. Hayes, he finally said, tipping his hat before walking away. Eleanor watched him go, her unease growing. There was more to Gabriel Winters than met the eye, and somehow she suspected it involved her. Her opportunity to investigate came the next morning when Winters was helping Rebecca down from her wagon. Eleanor approached just in time to hear Rebecca ask, "And what brought you west?" "Mr. Winters, looking for gold like so many others." "A promise," he replied, his voice low. "I made a promise to someone that I intend to keep." "How romantic," Rebecca said. "A deathbed vow to a sweetheart?" Winters' smile was strained. Something like that. He caught sight of Eleanor then, and a flash of alarm crossed his features before he masked it. "Mrs. Hayes, good morning." "Mr. Winters," Eleanor held his gaze steadily. "I wonder if I might ask your advice about the trail ahead for my oxen." It was a transparent excuse, but Winters nodded. "Of course." As they walked a short distance from the wagons, Eleanor wasted no time. "Who are you, Mr. Winters, and why do you keep watching me?" He stopped, surprised by her directness. "I'm exactly who I say I am." "I don't believe you. You know something about me or about Dr. Abernathy. Which is it?" For a moment, Winters seemed to debate with himself. Then his shoulders slumped slightly. "You're very observant, Mrs. Hayes." "I was married to a man who kept secrets," Eleanor said. "I learned to recognize the signs." Winters looked at her sharply. "Jonathan Hayes was a good man." The bottom dropped out of Eleanor's stomach. "You knew my husband." "We served together in Mexico," Winters admitted. "He spoke of you often." Eleanor felt lightheaded. "Why didn't you say so when we met?" "It's complicated." Winters ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't want to dredge up painful memories for you." "Oh, that's not the whole truth." No, it's not. But it's all I can tell you right now. His expression was earnest. Please trust that I mean you no harm, Mrs. Hayes. Quite the opposite. Before Eleanor could press further, a shout went up from the front of the wagon train. River ahead, prepare to ford. Winters seemed relieved by the interruption. I should help with the crossing. We can continue this conversation another time. As he strode away, Eleanor stood rooted in place, her mind racing. Gabriel Winters had served with Jonathan in Mexico, had known him well enough to recognize her Jonathan's wife years later on the Oregon Trail. And he was hiding something, something about Jonathan or about her or both. The mystery of it gnawed at her throughout the day as the wagon train slowly made its way across the shallow river. By evening, as they set up camp on the far bank, Eleanor had resolved to confront Winters again, to demand the full truth. But fate had other plans. The scream pierced the pre-dawn darkness, jolting Eleanor from sleep. She was out of her wagon in seconds, pulling a shawl around her nightdress as she followed the sound to its source, the Morgan wagon. Frederick stood outside, his face ashen in the light of the lantern he held. Mrs. Hayes, thank God, it's Rebecca, the baby. Something's wrong. Eleanor pushed past him into the wagon. Rebecca lay on their bed, her nightgown soaked with sweat, her face contorted in pain. One hand clutched her swollen belly. The baby's coming, Rebecca gasped when she saw Eleanor. But it's too early. It's too early. Eleanor immediately assessed the situation. Rebecca was only 7 months along. Far too soon for delivery, especially in these conditions. How long have you been having pains? She asked, laying a hand on Rebecca's abdomen. Since yesterday afternoon, but I thought it was just discomfort from the journey. Rebecca's voice broke on a sob. I didn't want to worry, Frederick. Eleanor felt the strong contraction ripple under her palm. There was no stopping this labor. Frederick, as she called, boil water and bring clean linens, and find Mrs. Schmidt. As he hurried to obey, Eleanor turned back to Rebecca. I need to examine you. Try to relax. The examination confirmed her fears. Rebecca was already well advanced in labor, and from the intensity of the contractions, delivery was imminent. The baby is coming now. Rebecca's eyes widened in terror. But it's too soon. Babies decide their own timing, Eleanor said, striving for a calm she didn't feel. And we're going to help this one arrive safely. Mrs. Schmidt arrived moments later, her usual composure unruffled despite the emergency. Early labor, Eleanor explained tersely. She's fully dilated. The old woman nodded immediately, moving to support Rebecca's shoulders. You are strong, young mother, stronger than you know. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Eleanor directed Frederick to gather more supplies, partly to give him something to do, and partly to spare him from witnessing his wife's agony. Mrs. Schmidt proved an invaluable assistant, her calm presence and steady hands a welcome complement to Eleanor's medical focus. Rebecca fought bravely, but the labor was difficult. By the time the sun began to rise, casting golden light through the wagon's canvas cover, she was exhausted. I can't, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Eleanor, I can't do this anymore. You can, Eleanor insisted, though her own fear was mounting. The baby was in distress. She could tell from the irregular heartbeat she felt through Rebecca's belly. You're almost there, one more big push. With a cry that seemed torn from her very soul, Rebecca bore down. There was a moment of terrible resistance and then suddenly release. A boy, Eleanor announced as the tiny infant slid into her waiting hands. But her triumph was short-lived. The baby was unnaturally still, his skin bluish rather than the healthy pink it should be. Working quickly, Eleanor cleared the child's airways and began gentle chest compressions with her fingertips. Come on, little one, she murmured. Breathe for me. Rebecca struggled to raise her head. Why isn't he crying? Eleanor, why isn't my baby crying? Before Eleanor could answer, the infant gave a weak, mewling cry, then a stronger one. Relief flooded through her as his skin began to pinken. He's breathing, she said, wrapping him quickly in a warm blanket. He's very small, but he's fighting. She placed the swaddled infant on Rebecca's chest, where the new mother gazed down in wonder. Hello, my son, she whispered. But the moment of joy was interrupted by another contraction. Rebecca's face contorted in pain. What's happening? Frederick demanded from the wagon entrance, where he had returned with fresh water. Eleanor's hands were already back on Rebecca's abdomen, feeling the unmistakable shape of a second baby. Twins, she said, meeting Mrs. Schmidt's startled gaze. She's carrying twins. The second delivery proceeded more quickly than the first, but it was clear that Rebecca's strength was failing. The blood loss was becoming concerning, and her pulse raced under Eleanor's fingertips. When the second boy was born, slightly larger than his brother but still dangerously small, Rebecca barely had the strength to look at him. "Two sons," she murmured as Eleanor placed the second infant beside the first. "Frederick will be so proud." "He is," Eleanor assured her, though her concern was growing by the minute. The bleeding wasn't stopping, despite all her efforts. "Rebecca, I need you to stay with me. Keep talking." But Rebecca's eyes were becoming unfocused, her skin taking on a waxy pallor. "Eleanor," she whispered, "remember your promise." "And you're going to be fine," Eleanor insisted, applying more pressure to stem the bleeding. "You'll raise these boys yourself." Rebecca's hand found hers surprisingly strong in its grip. "Take care of my sons, Eleanor. You're the only one I trust." "Mrs. Hayes," Mrs. Schmidt's voice was low but urgent. "We need more help. The mother is slipping away." Eleanor felt panic rising in her throat. "Frederick, I need Dr. Clark. Now." As Frederick raced to find the doctor, Eleanor fought desperately to save Rebecca. But the young mother's life was flowing out with her blood, and all of Eleanor's knowledge and determination couldn't stop it. Dr. Clark arrived, took one look at the situation, and paled. "My God," he muttered. "Help me," Eleanor pleaded. "There must be something we can do." Clark moved forward, but his hands shook as he examined Rebecca. I haven't dealt with postpartum hemorrhage since medical school, and never with twins." On that moment, Eleanor knew two things with terrible clarity. Clark was not the experienced physician he claimed to be, and Rebecca Morgan was going to die. The realization must have shown on her face because Rebecca's grip on her hand tightened. "Promise me," she whispered, her voice barely audible now. "Promise me you'll love them as your own." Tears blurred Eleanor's vision as she nodded. "I promise." A faint smile touched Rebecca's lips. Then her hand went slack, her eyes staring sightlessly at the canvas above. Eleanor felt something break inside her, a dam holding back all the grief she had carried for years. "No," she whispered. "No, Rebecca, please." But Rebecca Morgan was beyond hearing her body still, while her newborn sons wailed beside her as if they understood the magnitude of what they had just lost. The news spread through the camp like wildfire. Rebecca Morgan was dead. The captain's wife, beloved by all, had died giving birth to twin boys. The shock was palpable, a heavy cloud that settled over the wagon train. Eleanor moved through the aftermath in a daze, her hands and clothing still stained with Rebecca's blood. She had cleaned and wrapped the young mother's body with Mrs. Schmidt's help, while Frederick sat outside the wagon, cradling his newborn sons with a stunned expression. Now, as the morning sun climbed higher, families gathered to pay their respects. Women wept openly. Men stood awkwardly, removing their hats as they approached Frederick to offer condolences. Gabriel Winters appeared at Eleanor's side as she stood apart from the mourners, trying to collect herself. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Eleanor turned to him, suddenly furious. "You knew. Somehow you knew this would happen." Winters looked genuinely startled. "What? No, You led us on this route. You convinced Frederick to take this shortcut of yours. If we had stayed on the main trail, Rebecca might have reached a settlement before going into labor." The accusation was unfair, and Eleanor knew it even as the words left her mouth. But grief and guilt made her reckless, desperate to find someone to blame. Winter's face hardened. The shortcut had nothing to do with this Mrs. Hayes. Premature labor can happen anywhere. "Then why were you watching me? Why did you join our train? What do you know that you're not telling me?" Before Winters could respond, a commotion near the Morgan wagon drew their attention. Frederick had risen to his feet, his expression transformed from grief to something harder, more dangerous. "This journey continues," he announced, his voice carrying across the hushed camp. "We bury Rebecca here, and we move on tomorrow." Murmurs of surprise rippled through the gathered families. It was customary to pause for at least a day to properly mourn and bury the dead. "Captain," one of the older men ventured, "perhaps we should take some time to—" "Time is the one thing we don't have." Frederick cut him off. "Winter comes early to the mountains. Every day we delay puts all of us at risk." His gaze swept the crowd, challenging anyone to disagree. When no one did, he continued, his voice taking on a strange, detached quality. As for my sons, I cannot care for infants and lead this train. They require constant attention that I cannot provide. He paused, seeming to steel himself for what came next. Therefore, I am offering them for adoption, to any family willing and able to raise them. A shocked silence fell over the camp. Eleanor felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath her feet. Frederick was giving away his children, Rebecca's children. I'll pay $20 to whoever takes them, Frederick added, for the additional burden they represent. Harrison Wells stepped forward, his expression calculating. I'll give you $30 for both boys, Captain Morgan. My wife and I are experienced parents, and we have the resources to provide for them properly. Frederick nodded, seeming relieved that someone had volunteered so quickly. Thank you, Mr. Wells. If there are no other... Wait. Eleanor's voice surprised even herself as she pushed through the crowd to stand before Frederick. You can't do this, Captain. These are your sons, Rebecca's sons. Frederick's eyes were cold when they met hers. I am doing what is necessary for their survival and for the survival of this wagon train. I cannot be both father and leader. Then let me take them. The words tumbled out before Eleanor could consider their implications. I promised Rebecca I would care for them if anything happened to her. A murmur ran through the crowd. Harrison Wells stepped forward, his expression incredulous. You, a single woman with no experience raising children, these boys need a proper family, not a spinster playing at motherhood. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but she held her ground. I delivered these children. I held Rebecca's hand as she and I made her a promise that I intend to keep. Frederick looked torn, his gaze moving between Eleanor and the Wells family. Mrs. Hayes, I appreciate your dedication to my wife, but Mr. Wells makes a valid point. A childless widow traveling alone is hardly the ideal guardian for newborn twins. And yet it's what Rebecca wanted. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. She trusted me with her sons' lives. Can you truly ignore her final wish? For a moment, something like doubt flickered in Frederick's eyes. Then his expression hardened again. I need time to consider this. I'll make my decision by nightfall. As the crowd dispersed, Eleanor remained rooted in place, suddenly terrified by what she had done. She had volunteered to become mother to newborn twins in the middle of the wilderness, with hundreds of miles of dangerous territory still ahead. It was madness, and yet as she remembered Rebecca's final plea and the promise she had made, Eleanor knew she had no choice. She had failed to save the mother. She would not fail the sons, even if it meant facing the journey alone with two helpless infants depending on her for survival. Eleanor spent the remainder of that terrible day in a fog of grief and uncertainty. She busied herself with practical tasks, checking on the twins, preparing formulas from diluted cow's milk, instructing other women on how to hold and comfort the newborns. Anything to avoid thinking about the enormity of what she had done and what might lie ahead. The boys were impossibly small, the firstborn slightly smaller and with a tuft of dark hair that reminded Eleanor of Rebecca, had a weak cry that worried her. His brother, a little larger with a surprising cap of golden hair like his mother's, seemed stronger but was still dangerously tiny for the harsh conditions of the trail. They need names, Mrs. Schmidt said quietly as she helped Eleanor change the smaller twins' wrappings. Eleanor's hands stilled. That's not my decision to make. Perhaps, but they cannot be the twins forever. The older woman's weathered fingers gently stroked the baby's cheek. In the old country, we believed unnamed children were vulnerable to evil spirits. Frederick will name them, Eleanor insisted, though she wasn't certain the grief-stricken captain was capable of such a paternal act. As evening approached, Eleanor found herself sitting beside her wagon, the twins nestled in a makeshift cradle she had constructed from a wooden box lined with blankets. The larger boy was asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm of infancy. The smaller one was awake, dark eyes seeming to search Eleanor's face with an intensity that belied his newborn state. You look like her, Eleanor whispered, tracing a gentle finger along the baby's cheek. Your mother was so beautiful, so kind. The child's only response was to wrap his tiny hand around her finger, gripping with surprising strength. Mrs. Hayes. Eleanor looked up to find Lily Wells standing a few feet away, watching her with curious eyes. The 8-year-old clutched a small cloth doll, her posture unnaturally straight for a child her age. Hello, Lily, Eleanor said, summoning a smile. Would you like to see the babies? Lily approached cautiously as if afraid she might be scolded for showing interest. Father says they're going to be my new brothers. The words sent a pang through Eleanor's heart. That's one possibility. I had brothers once, Lily continued, her voice taking on the practiced cadence of a child reciting a lesson. Thomas and James, but they died when the sickness came. I'm very sorry, but Eleanor said gently. That must have been very hard for you and your parents. Lily shrugged the gesture, heartbreakingly adult. Father says we don't talk about sad things. We move forward and improve ourselves. Before Eleanor could respond to this troubling philosophy, the smaller twin began to fuss. She lifted him, carefully cradling him against her shoulder as she patted his back. Lily watched, fascinated. Does he have a name? Not yet. Your father and Captain Morgan will decide what happens to both babies tonight. The girl's eyes widened slightly. But you want to keep them, don't you? I heard you say so. Eleanor hesitated, unsure how to explain her complicated feelings to a child. I made a promise to their mother before she died. I intend to honor it if I can. Lily seemed to consider this seriously. I think they should stay with you, she finally said. You look at them the way Mother used to look at Thomas and James. The simple observation delivered with a child's unflinching honesty brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. Thank you, Lily. A sharp voice interrupted their moment. Lily, come away from there at once. Martha Wells hurried toward them, her normally placid face taut with displeasure. You know your father doesn't want you wandering around the camp alone. I was just looking at the baby's mother. Lily protested, her body tensing in a way that made Eleanor's heart ache. The babies are not your concern. Martha took her daughter's arm, pulling her away from Eleanor's wagon. I'm sorry for the intrusion, Mrs. Hayes. Lily knows better than to bother people. She wasn't bothering me, Eleanor said, but Martha had already turned away, leading her daughter back toward their wagon with urgent whispers about proper behavior. Eleanor watched them go, disturbed by the interaction. There was something in Martha's manner, a brittleness, a fear that went beyond normal maternal concern. And Lily's immediate submission spoke of a household ruled by rigid expectations. Poor little one, she murmured, unsure if she meant Lily or the infant in her arms. Perhaps both. As twilight descended over the camp, a somber mood persisted. Rebecca's burial had taken place that afternoon, a hastily arranged ceremony at which Frederick had stood stone-faced and silent. Now, as campfires flickered to life against the gathering darkness, Eleanor knew the moment of decision was approaching. Gabriel Winters appeared beside her wagon, carrying a steaming tin cup. Thought you might need this, he said, offering the cup. It's been a long day. Eleanor accepted the coffee with murmured thanks, noting the dark shadows under his eyes. You knew my husband, she said, too exhausted for pretense. Tell me how. Winters sighed, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. We served in the same regiment in Mexico. Jonathan was a brave man, saved my life at Veracruz. Why didn't you tell me this when we first met? I wasn't sure how you'd react. Winters shifted uncomfortably, and I wasn't certain it was my place to bring up memories that might be painful. Eleanor studied his face, searching for deception, but finding only weariness and what appeared to be genuine concern. There's more you're not telling me. Yes, he admitted, but now isn't the time. You have more immediate concerns. He nodded toward the twins. Have you thought about what happens if Morgan chooses the Wells family? I made a promise, Eleanor said simply. Even promises have limits, Mrs. Hayes. 2 infants on the trail with winter coming and hundreds of miles still ahead. He shook his head. It would be difficult for a family with help. For a woman alone, it might be impossible. Eleanor felt a flare of indignation. Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I haven't spent every moment since Rebecca died calculating the risks? But what choice do I have? I promised her. Winters studied her for a long moment. You have the same stubborn determination he described, he said quietly. Who, Jonathan? He said once that if the world were ended, he'd want you beside him because you'd find a way to survive it. A ghost of a smile touched Winters' lips. I think he was right. Before Eleanor could respond, a hush fell over the camp. Frederick Morgan was approaching, his tall figure silhouetted against the central fire. Behind him came Harrison Wells and his wife, their daughter walking between them with perfect posture. Eleanor set down her coffee cup with trembling hands and rose to her feet. The moment of judgment had arrived. Frederick stopped a few paces from her wagon, his face unreadable in the gathering dusk. Mrs. Hayes, he began, his voice formal and distant. Mr. and Mrs. Wells have made a generous offer for the care of my sons. $30 plus the assurance that the boys will be raised with every advantage. Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight for words. However, Frederick continued, I am also mindful of the promise you made to Rebecca and of your dedication in delivering my sons when, he faltered briefly, when their mother could not be saved. Harrison Wells stepped forward. Captain Morgan, with all due respect, sentimentality has no place in such decisions. These children need stability, resources, proper care. They need love, Mr. Wells, Eleanor interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. They need someone who will see them as precious beings, not as replacements for what was lost. Martha Wells gasped at the implied criticism, but her husband's face merely hardened. How dare you suggest? Enough. Frederick's voice cut through the brewing argument. I've made my decision. Eleanor held her breath, acutely aware of Gabriel Winters standing supportively at her side. Mrs. Hayes will take the twins, Frederick announced. She delivered them, she promised their mother she would care for them, and I believe she has the knowledge necessary to give them their best chance at survival. Relief flooded through Eleanor, so intense she felt her knees weaken. Only Winters' steadying hand on her elbow kept her upright. This is absurd. Harrison Wells sputtered. Captain, you cannot entrust your sons to a widow with no experience raising children. My wife and I have a proper home prepared in Oregon, servants' resources. My decision is final. Frederick's tone left no room for argument. Mrs. Hayes, I'll have the proper papers drawn up in the morning. The boys are now legally in your care. As he turned to leave, Eleanor found her voice. Captain Morgan, she called. What are their names? Frederick paused, looking back at the small bundles in the makeshift cradle. For a moment, grief cracked his stoic facade. Rebecca liked the names Samuel and Joshua, he said softly. Samuel for the firstborn, Joshua for the second. With that, he walked away, leaving Eleanor standing beside her wagon with two newborn babies who were suddenly terrifyingly hers to raise. Harrison Wells glared at her with naked contempt. You've made a grave mistake, Captain Morgan, he called after Frederick's retreating figure. And you, Mrs. Hayes, you'll regret taking on more than you can handle. As the Wells family stalked away, Gabriel Winters let out a low whistle. Well, you've certainly made an enemy there. I already had one in Dr. Clark, Eleanor replied, her voice steadier than as she felt. What's one more? Aye, Winters chuckled, then grew serious. You know this won't be easy. Eleanor looked down at the sleeping twins, at Samuel and Joshua. She corrected herself. Their names were Samuel and Joshua now. Nothing worthwhile ever is. Then you'll need help. Winters moved to her wagon and began rearranging the contents, creating a more secure space for the cradle. First thing, we need to modify your wagon. Babies need security, especially on rough trails. Eleanor watched in surprise as he worked his movements efficient and purposeful. You know about caring for infants? I know about improvising in difficult situations. He glanced up with a half smile, and I've picked up a few things in my travels. As Winters continued his modifications, securing the cradle and creating a canopy to protect the babies from sun and dust, Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope break through her exhaustion and fear. Perhaps she wasn't completely alone in this impossible task after all. The next 3 weeks transformed Eleanor's life in ways she could never have imagined. The wagon train resumed its westward journey the day after Rebecca's burial, but for Eleanor, everything had changed. Her days, once organized around her medical duties in quiet solitude, now revolved entirely around Samuel and Joshua's needs. The challenges began immediately. Neither twin would accept the diluted cow's milk Eleanor had prepared, refusing the cloth nipples with increasingly desperate cries. It was Mrs. Schmidt who provided the solution, showing Eleanor how to prepare a mixture of goat's milk water and a small amount of molasses that the babies would tolerate. My mother's recipe, the older woman explained as she demonstrated the proper proportions, saved many babies in the old country when mothers could not feed them. Sleep became a distant memory. The twins operated on different schedules, ensuring that just as one settled, the other would wake demanding food or comfort. Eleanor learned to function in a constant state of exhaustion, catching moments of rest whenever both babies allowed it. The physical demands of the trail continued unabated. Each morning, the wagon train broke camp at dawn, traveling until the heat of the day forced a brief rest, then continuing until dusk. Eleanor had to manage her team of oxen, maintain her wagon, and contribute to the communal tasks of the train, all while caring for two newborns who required feeding every 2 hours. It would have been impossible without help. To Eleanor's surprise, assistance came from unexpected quarters. Mrs. Schmidt became a regular presence, sharing her wisdom about infant care and occasionally watching the twins so Eleanor could rest. Several of the mothers in the train took turns helping with feedings during the night. Even Frederick, despite his emotional distance, ensured that Eleanor's wagon was positioned optimally in the train and that she received extra rations from the communal supplies. But most surprising, it was Gabriel Winter's constant support. He rode beside her wagon each day, taking the reins when she needed to tend to the babies. In the evenings, he helped with camp chores, freeing Eleanor to focus on the twins. His knowledge of the trail proved invaluable as they navigated increasingly difficult terrain, and his quiet competence was a steadying presence amid the chaos of her new responsibilities. Yet he remained an enigma. Though he had admitted to knowing Jonathan, he deflected further questions about their relationship or about his reasons for joining the wagon train. Eleanor sensed he was waiting for something, some moment or circumstance that would allow him to reveal whatever secret he carried. Not everyone was supportive. Clark made his disapproval clear, spreading whispers that Eleanor's medical neglect had contributed to Rebecca's death and that the twins were now at risk under her care. Harrison Wells maintained a cold hostility, while Martha watched from a distance with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite interpret, something between envy and concern. And then there was Lily Wells, who continued to find ways to visit Eleanor's wagon despite her parents' disapproval. The girls seemed drawn to the babies, watching them with solemn fascination and occasionally helping with small tasks like folding diapers or preparing bottles. "Were your brother's babies when they died?" Eleanor asked her one afternoon, as Lily sat cross-legged beside the wagon, carefully folding a stack of clean cloths. The girl nodded, her eyes fixed on her task. "Thomas was 2. James was just a baby like Samuel and Joshua. You must miss them very much. Father says dwelling on the past makes us weak." Lily's small hands continued their methodical folding. "He says we must focus on improvement and progress." Eleanor studied the child's rigid posture, the careful precision of her movements. "And what do you think, Lily?" The question seemed to surprise the girl. She looked up, blinking as if no one had ever asked for her opinion before. "I think," she glanced around nervously, "I think it's lonely without them, and I'm afraid to forget what they looked like." The simple admission, delivered in a whisper, broke Eleanor's heart. "It's not weak to remember those we love," she said gently. "Memory keeps them with us in a way." Lily's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. "Father would be angry if he heard you say that." "Then it can be our secret." Eleanor reached out to brush a strand of hair from the girl's face. "You're welcome to visit Samuel and Joshua whenever you like, Lily. They could use a big sister to look out for them." A tentative smile transformed the child's solemn face. "Really, I could be like their sister." "Of course. Family isn't just about who we're born to. It's about who we choose to love." As the words left her mouth, Eleanor realized their truth. These babies born to Rebecca and Frederick Morgan had somehow become hers in a way that transcended blood. When she held them, when she soothed their cries or marveled at their tiny, perfect fingers, she felt a love so fierce it frightened her. A mother's love, though she had never given birth. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. For years, she had defined herself by what she lacked, a child of her own. Now, against all odds, she had been given not one, but 2 children to love and protect. The circumstances were far from ideal, the challenges nearly overwhelming. But in those quiet moments when both babies slept peacefully and she could simply watch their innocent faces, Eleanor felt a completeness she had never known before. It was during one such peaceful moment, as the wagon train made camp at the base of a rising slope that marked the beginning of the Rocky Mountain foothills, that Eleanor finally had the opportunity to examine Jonathan's journal more carefully. With both twins asleep and the evening chores completed, she sat beside her small fire and opened the worn leather cover. Most of the entries were mundane daily observations from Jonathan's military service. Brief mentions of battles and marches, occasional comments about comrades. He had never been an effusive writer, But as she flipped through the pages, a name caught her eye: Gabriel Winters. March 12th, 1847. Winters took a Mexican bullet today that was meant for me. The surgeons say he'll recover, but it was a near thing. I owe him my life. If anything happens to me, I must make sure he knows to look after Eleanor. Eleanor's breath caught. So that was the connection. Jonathan had asked Gabriel to watch over her. But why hadn't Winters simply told her this? She read on scanning entries until another passage made her heart stop. April 17th, 1847. Letter from home today. Eleanor lost the baby. She never even knew she was carrying. Dr. Abernathy thought it best not to tell her given her fragile state after the previous disappointments. Perhaps he's right, but I hate the thought of such a secret between us. The child that Eleanor never knew existed. May God forgive me for keeping it from her. The journal slipped from Eleanor's numb fingers. She had been pregnant and lost the baby without ever knowing it, while Jonathan was away at war. Dr. Abernathy had made the decision to keep this from her, and Jonathan had agreed. A decade and a half of monthly disappointments, of wondering what was wrong with her, of watching other women bear children while her arms remained empty, and all that time she had been capable of conception. The knowledge might have changed everything. It might have given her hope, a reason to keep trying. Instead, the men in her life had decided she was too fragile for the truth. Anger surged through her, hot and unfamiliar. Eleanor was not given to rage, had always prided herself on her composure and rationality. But this felt like betrayal. From Jonathan, from Dr. Abernathy, from the entire medical establishment that viewed women as delicate creatures who couldn't be trusted with their own body's truths. Mrs. Hayes, Eleanor looked up to find Gabriel Winters standing a few feet away, concern etched on his features. He must have seen something in her expression because he took a step back. You read it, he said, nodding toward the journal on the ground. You know. You knew. It wasn't a question. You knew I had been pregnant, that they kept it from me. That's why you've been watching me, isn't it? Jonathan asked you to protect me, but from what? The truth, Winters sighed heavily. May I sit? When Eleanor nodded stiffly, he lowered himself to the ground across the fire from her. The flames illuminated the weariness in his face, the burden of whatever he had been carrying. Jonathan made me promise to find you if he didn't survive the war, Winters began, to make sure you were all right. But he also made me promise not to tell you about the baby unless, he hesitated, unless it became necessary. Necessary? Eleanor's voice shook with suppressed emotion. 15 years, I blamed myself for not being able to give Jonathan a child. 15 years of monthly grief and shame. And all that time I could have known that it wasn't impossible, just difficult. How was that kindness? It wasn't, Winters admitted. But Jonathan believed Dr. Abernathy when he said the knowledge would only cause you more pain. That it was a kindness to spare you the grief of losing a child you never knew you had. Eleanor stared into the fire, trying to process this revelation. And what do you believe, Mr. Winters? Was it a kindness? No. His answer came without hesitation. I argued with Jonathan about it. Told him you deserve to know your own history, to make your own choices about how to grieve. But it wasn't my place to override his decision about his wife. Then why tell me now? Winters gestured toward the sleeping twins. Because you've taken on the greatest responsibility a person can assume, parenthood. And you deserve to know that Jonathan always believed you would be an exceptional mother, that he regretted not giving you the chance. Eleanor felt tears welling, the anger gradually giving way to a deeper, more complex emotion. Grief for what might have been for the child she had never known, for the years spent believing herself barren, but also a strange gratitude that the truth had finally come to light. Thank you for telling me, she said finally, even if it took you 3 weeks to find the courage. A rueful smile crossed Winters' face. Courage was never my strong suit. Jonathan was the brave one. And yet you took a bullet for him. That wasn't bravery, just instinct. Winters poked at the fire with a stick. The brave thing would have been telling you the truth from the beginning. They sat in silence for a moment, the crackling fire and distant sounds of the camp the only interruption. Finally, Eleanor asked the question that had been hovering since she first read the journal entry. Did Jonathan ask you to follow me west? Is that why you joined our train? Winters nodded slowly. His last letter asked me to check on you if I ever passed through St. Louis. When I did a year after his death, I learned you had sold your house and joined a wagon train bound for Oregon. I tracked you to Independence, then joined the train as a guide. To protect me. Eleanor wasn't sure whether to feel comforted or irritated by this posthumous meddling from her husband. To keep a promise, Winters corrected. But yes, to make sure you reached Oregon safely. Jonathan would have wanted that. Eleanor considered this, then asked the question that had been nagging at her since their first meeting. Why do you seem so familiar to me? Have we met before? A strange expression crossed Winter's face, something between guilt and resignation. No, we haven't. But Jonathan had a daguerreotype of you that he carried everywhere. He showed it to me so often, talked about you so much, that when I finally saw you in person, he shrugged. It was like meeting someone I already knew. The explanation made sense, yet Eleanor sensed there was still something he wasn't telling her. Before she could press further, a small cry came from her wagon. Samuel, she said, recognizing the distinctive sound of her smaller son's hunger cry. He'll need feeding. Winters rose, offering his hand to help her up. I'll get the milk mixture ready while you tend to him. As Eleanor lifted the fussing infant from his cradle, soothing him with gentle words, she felt a strange peace settle over her. The truth about her past was painful, but it was still the truth. And perhaps knowing it would help her build a future for the two small lives now entrusted to her care. The next morning brought new challenges. As the wagon train prepared to begin its ascent into the Rocky Mountains, tension rippled through the camp. The path ahead was notoriously treacherous, with steep inclines, narrow passages, and the constant threat of early snow. Eleanor was changing the twins when Dr. Clark approached her wagon, his expression grim. Mrs. Hayes, a word if I may. She continued her task, not looking up. What is it, Dr. Clark? I've been observing the smaller twin. Samuel, is it? His color concerns me. And that cough that started yesterday. Clark shook his head solemnly. Mountain travel is extremely dangerous for infants in peak health. For one showing signs of respiratory distress, it could be fatal. Eleanor's hands stilled. It was true that Samuel had developed a slight cough, and his complexion was paler than his brother's. But she had been monitoring him closely and had seen no serious cause for alarm. What exactly are you suggesting, Dr. Clark? Only that you might consider what's truly best for the child. Clark's voice took on a sanctimonious tone. The Wells family has expressed willingness to take both boys even after your interference. They could remain in the lowlands with proper care while you continue your journey. Eleanor looked up at him sharply. You mean abandon Samuel to the Wells family? Separate the twins. I mean prioritize the child's survival over your maternal sentimentality. Clark's mask of concern slipped, revealing the disdain beneath. These mountains kill grown men, Mrs. Hayes. What chance does a sickly infant have? Eleanor felt a cold fury building within her. Thank you for your professional opinion, Dr. Clark. Now I'll thank you to leave my wagon and my sons alone. Clark's face hardened. This stubbornness will cost that child his life. Remember that when you're burying him on some mountainside. As he stalked away, Eleanor fought to control her shaking hands. Clark's words had struck at her deepest fear that she was inadequate to the task she had undertaken, that her inexperience might endanger the very lives she had promised to protect. She looked down at Samuel, sleeping peacefully now after his feeding. His breathing seemed regular, if slightly congested. Was Clark right? Was she risking his life by taking him into the mountains? Don't listen to him. Eleanor turned to find Gabriel Winters approaching, leading her team of oxen already harnessed for the day's journey. Clark's working for Wells, Winters continued, keeping his voice low. I overheard them talking last night. Wells promised him a position as the town doctor when they established their trading post in Oregon. So this sudden concern for Samuel's health is a strategy to separate you from at least one of the twins. Winters secured the oxen to her wagon. Clark believes if you lose one, you will eventually give up the other as well. Eleanor felt sick at the calculation behind such a scheme. How could anyone think of separating them? They're brothers. Wells lost twin sons, Winters reminded her. In his mind, he's simply reclaiming what was taken from him. And if he can only get one of Rebecca's twins for now, he'll consider it a partial victory. Eleanor glanced toward the Wells wagon where Harrison was directing the loading of their extensive supplies with military precision. Lily stood nearby watching the activity with the too serious expression that had become familiar to Eleanor. What about Martha and Lily? Are they part of this scheme? Winters shook his head. I don't think so. Martha seems genuinely concerned for the twins' welfare, if a bit passive about how her husband pursues it. And Lily? He smiled slightly. Lily seems firmly in your camp. As if sensing their discussion, Lily looked up and caught Eleanor's eye. The girl gave a small, secret wave before quickly returning her attention to her father's instructions. We need to be especially vigilant once we're in the mountains, Winters said, helping Eleanor secure the twins' cradle for travel. The terrain will provide plenty of opportunities for accidents or separations. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. You think they'd go that far? I think Wells is a man accustomed to getting what he wants by whatever means necessary. Winters checked the final harness. And I think you're a woman who's underestimated the strength of a mother's love. I'm not their mother, Eleanor corrected automatically, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. Winters gave her a knowing look. Tell yourself that if you want, but I've seen how you look at them, how you respond to their cries before they even fully wake, how you know which is which even when they're bundled identically. He paused, his expression softening. Blood doesn't make a mother, Mrs. Hayes. Love does. Before Eleanor could respond, Frederick Morgan's voice called out across the camp. Wagons ready? We move in 10 minutes. The day's journey began with a steep incline that tested both oxen and humans. The trail narrowed as they climbed, forcing the wagons to proceed in single file with barely enough room on either side for the walkers accompanying them. Eleanor rode in her wagon, one arm protectively braced against the twins' cradle as the vehicle jolted over the uneven terrain. Gabriel Winters walked beside her team, occasionally calling encouragement to the straining oxen or pointing out particularly treacherous spots in the path ahead. By midday, the wagon train had climbed high enough that the valley below was spread out like a quilt. The river they had crossed days earlier, now a silver thread in the distance. The air was noticeably thinner, cooler, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of the approaching autumn. Eleanor checked on the twins, frequently worried about the altitude's effect on their breathing. Joshua seemed untroubled, sleeping soundly despite the wagon's constant movement. Samuel's breathing was slightly labored, but his color remained good and his temperature normal when Eleanor pressed her lips to his forehead. How are they? Winters asked during a brief stop to rest the oxen. Holding their own, Eleanor replied, adjusting the blankets around the infants. Samuel's congestion doesn't seem to be worsening despite Clark's dire predictions. Winters smiled. They're resilient like their guardian. The unexpected compliment brought warmth to Eleanor's cheeks. She turned away ostensibly to check on her oxen, but really to hide her reaction. Since Jonathan's death, she had grown unaccustomed to male attention of any kind, and something in Winters' tone suggested more than mere friendly support. The moment was interrupted by Frederick Morgan riding back from his position at the head of the train. We need to keep moving, he announced to the resting travelers. There's a suitable camping spot 3 miles ahead, but we need to reach it before dark. As the wagon train resumed its slow ascent, Eleanor noticed dark clouds gathering over the distant peaks. Storm coming, she murmured to Winters. He nodded grimly. Let's hope we reach camp before it hits. They didn't. 2 miles short of their destination, the skies opened. Rain poured down in sheets, quickly turning the trail to mud that sucked at wagon wheels and oxen hooves. Eleanor frantically worked to secure the canvas covering of her wagon, ensuring the twins remained dry in their protected cradle. The storm transformed an already difficult climb into a treacherous ordeal. Wagons slipped and slid on the muddy incline. Voices called out in alarm as teams struggled to maintain their footing. Children cried, frightened by the thunder that echoed through the mountain passes. Eleanor's wagon was midway up a particularly steep section when disaster struck. The Wells wagon ahead of them lost traction, its wheels spinning helplessly in the mud before beginning a slow, inexorable slide backward. Pull aside, Winters shouted frantically, attempting to guide Eleanor's oxen off the narrow trail. They're going to hit us. But there was nowhere to go. Sheer rock rose on one side of the trail, a steep drop-off waited on the other. Eleanor could only watch in horror as the massive Wells wagon slid toward them, gathering speed. The impact when it came was deafening. Wood splintered as the rear of the Wells wagon collided with Eleanor's team. The oxen bellowed in panic, straining against their harnesses as Eleanor's wagon began to tip precariously toward the edge of the trail. "The babies!" Eleanor screamed, lunging for the cradle as her wagon tilted further. Through the chaos, she was dimly aware of Winters scrambling up the inclined wagon bed, reaching for the twins, even as the vehicle threatened to topple completely. He grabbed the cradle just as the right wheels left the ground, the entire wagon now balanced on its left side. "Jump!" he yelled, thrusting the cradle into Eleanor's arms. "Now!" Eleanor clutched the twins and leaped from the wagon just as it lost its tenuous balance and tipped over the edge of the trail. She landed hard on the muddy ground, curling her body around the cradle to protect the infants inside. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the need to check on Samuel and Joshua. They were crying, terrified, hungry, wet, but alive. Both alive. Mrs. Hay. Winters was beside her, his face streaked with mud and blood from a cut on his forehead. "Are you hurt?" Eleanor shook her head, unable to speak through the shock. Beyond Winters, she could see her wagon tumbling down the mountainside, splintering against rocks as it fell. Everything she owned, her medical supply, clothing, food, personal possessions, gone in an instant. The Wells wagon had finally stopped its backward slide, coming to rest at an angle across the trail. Harrison Wells was shouting orders, directing men to secure his vehicle while ignoring the destruction he had caused. "Eleanor, the babies." Martha Wells appeared through the rain, her face pale with concern. "Are they injured?" "They're alive," Eleanor managed, her voice hoarse. Frightened but alive. Martha looked genuinely relieved, reaching out tentatively toward the cradle. "Let me help you. You can shelter in our wagon until—" "No," the force of Eleanor's refusal surprised even herself. "No, thank you." Martha drew back, hurt flashing across her features. "I only meant to help." "Your husband's wagon just destroyed everything I own," Eleanor said, rising unsteadily to her feet with Winters' assistance. "Forgive me if I'm not eager to accept your charity." Frederick Morgan arrived then, taking in the scene with a quick, assessing gaze. "Mrs. Hayes, your wagon is at the bottom of the ravine," Eleanor finished for him, "along with everything I owned except these children." Frederick's expression was grim. "We'll arrange space for you in another wagon until we can find a replacement for yours." "In the meantime," Harrison Wells interjected, striding toward them with Lily trailing nervously behind, "my wife has offered our wagon as shelter, a generous proposal given the circumstances." "Circumstances that your carelessness created," Winters pointed out, his voice cold with anger. Wells drew himself up indignantly. "How dare you suggest—" "Enough," Frederick interrupted. "We need to get everyone to safety before this storm worsens. Mrs. Hayes, you and the twins will ride with the Washburn sisters for now. Mr. Winters help her transfer what she can salvage." As the wagon train slowly reorganized and continued its laborious climb, Eleanor found herself seated in the Washburn sisters' neat, cramped wagon, the twins cradled in her lap. The elderly sisters fussed around her, offering dry blankets and hot tea, exclaiming over the baby's miraculous survival. "Providence," Beatrice Washburn declared, tucking a blanket more securely around Eleanor's shoulders. "The Lord was watching over these little ones today." Eleanor nodded absently, her mind still reeling from the sudden catastrophe. In a matter of moments, she had lost everything except the clothes on her back and the two infants in her arms. How could she possibly care for them now without supplies, without a wagon, without even a change of clothing? The practical challenges seemed insurmountable. Yet as she looked down at Samuel and Joshua, now sleeping peacefully after their ordeal, she felt a renewed determination surge through her. These children had survived against all odds: premature birth, the loss of their mother, and now a wagon accident that could easily have killed them all. She would not fail them now. "Mrs. Hayes," Gabriel Winters appeared at the back of the Washburn wagon, his expression grave. "We need to talk." Eleanor gently handed the sleeping twins to Beatrice Washburn and made her way to the rear of the wagon, where Winters waited in the shelter of the canvas cover. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle, but thunder still rumbled in the distance. "What is it?" she asked, noting the tension in his posture. "That was no accident," Winters said quietly. "I examined the Wells wagon. Their brake was disengaged deliberately." Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. "Are you saying Harrison Wells intentionally caused the crash? He could have killed his own family." Martha and Lily were walking ahead with one of the servants. Only the driver was on the wagon, and he jumped clear before it hit yours. Winter's expression was grim. Wells knew exactly what he was doing. But why? What could possibly justify such a risk? To separate you from the twins. Winters glanced toward the front of the wagon where the Washburn sisters were cooing over the sleeping infants. Think about it. You lose your wagon, all your supplies. You're now dependent on the charity of others. What better time for Wells to argue that you're no longer capable of caring for two babies? The calculated cruelty of such a plan left Eleanor breathless. Surely Frederick wouldn't agree to. Frederick is focused on getting this train through the mountains before winter. He might see the practical advantages of having the wealthy Wells family take responsibility for his sons. Eleanor felt cold despite the blanket around her shoulders. What do we do? Oh, we stay vigilant. We keep the twins with you at all times. Winters hesitated, then added, and I think it's time I told Frederick about my suspicions regarding Wells and Clark. Do you have proof? Not yet, but I will. Winter's expression hardened with determination. I promised Jonathan I'd keep you safe. That promise now extends to Samuel and Joshua as well. As Eleanor watched him disappear into the rainy gloom, she was struck by the realization that in the space of 3 weeks her life had been completely transformed. She had lost almost everything that connected her to her past, her home in St. Louis, Jonathan's possessions, and now even the wagon and supplies that had represented her independence. Yet in their place, she had gained something far more precious. 2 children who depended on her completely, and allies like Gabriel Winters and the Washburn sisters who had stepped forward to help when she needed it most. The storm continued to rage around them as the wagon train struggled toward shelter. But within Eleanor, a different kind of storm was brewing, one made of equal parts fear and fierce determination. Harrison Wells had underestimated her, once believing that a lone woman would easily give up when faced with adversity. He would not make that mistake again. The higher they climbed into the Rocky Mountains, the more Eleanor understood why settlers spoke of these passages with dread. The air grew thinner, the wind sharper, and the trail narrower with each passing day. Temperatures dropped dramatically at night, forcing the travelers to burn through their precious firewood supplies at an alarming rate. 2 weeks had passed since the destruction of Eleanor's wagon. She now shared the Washburn sisters' vehicle, a cramped arrangement that the elderly siblings bore with remarkable grace. The twins, now 6 weeks old, seemed oblivious to their precarious circumstances, growing stronger despite the hardships of mountain travel. Samuel, the smaller twin, had overcome his respiratory difficulties, though Eleanor still watched him with particular vigilance. Joshua had developed a robust appetite that kept Eleanor constantly preparing milk mixtures. Both boys now showed signs of recognizing her voice, turning their heads when she spoke, and quieting when she held them. The loss of her wagon and supplies had created difficulties Eleanor hadn't anticipated. She had salvaged almost nothing from the wreckage, a few medical implements, a single change of clothing, and Jonathan's journal. Everything else, her stores of dried food, her carefully packed medicines and herbs, her books and personal mementos lay scattered and ruined at the bottom of a ravine. The generosity of the wagon train's families had sustained her. Women contributed spare clothing, diapers fashioned from flour sacks, blankets unraveled and reknitted into tiny caps and booties. Men shared their rations without complaint, understanding that Eleanor needed strength to provide for the infants. Even Frederick Morgan, still remote in his grief, ensured that she received a fair portion of the communal supplies. Only the Wells family and Dr. Clark maintained their distance, though Eleanor often caught Harrison Wells watching her with calculating eyes. Whatever his next move might be, he was waiting for the right moment. Gabriel Winters had become Eleanor's most steadfast ally. He spent his evenings constructing a new cradle for the twins, more compact than the previous one, to accommodate their shared quarters with the Washburns. During the day, he walked beside their wagon, always vigilant, always ready to assist when the trail became particularly treacherous. The travelers had settled into a tense rhythm of survival when the first signs of real trouble appeared. Eleanor was feeding Samuel while Joshua slept in his cradle when Beatrice Washburn returned from a conversation with Frederick Morgan, her usually placid face tight with worry. Captain Morgan says there's snow on the higher passes. She reported, busying herself with reorganizing supplies to hide her anxiety. Earlier than expected. Eleanor looked up sharply. How much earlier? 3 weeks, perhaps 4. Beatrice's hands trembled slightly as she folded a blanket. He's considering whether we should turn back to the last valley and wait out the winter there. The implications were immediately clear. Turning back meant months of delay, depleted supplies, and the very real possibility that some families wouldn't survive until spring. But continuing forward risked being trapped in the mountains when the heavy snows came a death sentence, as the Donner Party had tragically demonstrated just 3 years earlier. "What does Mr. Winters think?" Eleanor asked, shifting Samuel to her shoulder to burp him. "He's scouting ahead with some of the men. They should return by nightfall with a report." Beatrice glanced at the sleeping Joshua. "Eleanor, if we turn back, what will you do without your own wagon or supplies?" The question hung in the air, giving voice to fears Eleanor had been suppressing. If the wagon train retreated to winter in the valley, her position would become even more precarious. The collective goodwill that currently supported her might not extend to months of shared quarters and shared resources. "I'll manage," Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. "The twins and I will manage." But as the day progressed and the temperature continued to drop, Eleanor's worries grew. By late afternoon, a light snow had begun to fall, just a dusting, but a clear warning of what was to come. The wagon train halted earlier than usual, forming its protective circle in a small clearing sheltered by towering pines. Gabriel Winters and the scouting party returned. As dusk approached, their expressions grim. Eleanor watched from the Washburns' wagon as they conferred with Frederick Morgan, gesturing toward the looming peaks ahead. Whatever news they brought, it wasn't good. "Mrs. Hayes," Dr. Clark appeared beside the wagon, his breath visible in the cold air. "I wonder if I might examine the infants. This altitude and cold pose significant risks for one so young." Eleanor felt her guard rise immediately. "They're sleeping, Dr. Clark, and they're perfectly healthy." Even young Samuel, Clark's concerns seemed genuine, but Eleanor had learned to distrust his motivations. "I heard he had some respiratory difficulties earlier." "He's recovered fully, thank you." Clark leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Mrs. Hayes, I understand your attachment to these children, but with winter coming early and our situation growing precarious, wouldn't they be better served in a more stable arrangement?" "You mean with the Wells family?" Eleanor didn't phrase it as a question. "They have resources, servants, a proper wagon with a stove." Clark glanced meaningfully at the cramped quarters Eleanor now shared with the Washburn sisters. "Think of the children, Mrs. Hayes, not your own desires." Eleanor felt a familiar anger rising. "I am thinking of the children, Dr. Clark. I'm thinking they deserve to be raised by someone who values them for themselves, not as replacements for what was lost." Clark's expression hardened. "This stubborn sentimentality will endanger their lives when the real storms come. Remember that." As he walked away, Eleanor fought to calm her racing heart. Clark's warning echoed her own fears that the coming winter might indeed prove too difficult for her to protect Samuel and Joshua alone. Gabriel Winters approached the wagon snow, dusting his shoulders and hat. His expression confirmed what Eleanor had already guessed. "The pass ahead is already accumulating snow," he said without preamble. "Another week, and it will be impassable." "So we turn back." Winters shook his head. "Morgan wants to push forward. He says if we wait for spring, many families will run out of supplies. Better to risk the snow than certain starvation." "Is he right?" "Possibly." Winters brushed snow from his coat. "But it will be dangerous, very dangerous." Eleanor thought of the tiny lives depending on her, of their vulnerability in the face of mountain winter. "What would you do if the decision were yours?" Winters considered this, his gaze moving across the camp, where families were preparing their evening meals. "I would go forward," he finally said. "But I would send the most vulnerable members of the train back to the valley with enough supplies to last until spring." "The most vulnerable," Eleanor repeated, "like infants. And their guardians." Winters met her eyes steadily. "Eleanor, no one would think less of you for turning back. The twins need stability and care, not another upheaval." Eleanor squared her shoulders. "We go forward with the others." Winters studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I thought you might say that, which is why I've been working on this." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. Eleanor recognized it immediately, a rough map of the mountain passes ahead. "There's another route," Winters explained, pointing to a thin line that diverged from their current path. Less direct but lower in elevation. The snow will be lighter, the terrain more forgiving. Why haven't you shown this to Frederick? I have. He thinks it's too great a detour. Winters folded the map carefully. But a smaller party could take this route while the main train continues on the direct path. Eleanor understood what he was suggesting. You want us to separate from the train, the twins and me. And me, Winters added, and anyone else who prefers the safer route. The Washburn sisters, perhaps. Maybe some of the families with younger children. Frederick would never agree to splitting the train. He might if it means fewer people to worry about on the more treacherous path. Winters tucked the map back into his coat. Think about it, Eleanor. We could avoid the worst of the winter storms and still reach Oregon before spring. Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion erupted near the center of the camp. Frederick Morgan stood on a wagon seat calling for the travelers' attention. The camp quieted as people gathered to hear what their leader had to say. We have a decision to make, Frederick began, his voice carrying in the still mountain air. The passes ahead are beginning to be with the snow earlier than expected. We have two choices: turn back to the valley and winter there, or push forward and attempt to cross before the heavy snows make it impossible. Murmurs ran through the assembled families as they contemplated these options. Eleanor made her way closer, leaving the twins in Beatrice Washburn's care. I believe our best chance is to continue forward, Frederick continued. If we move quickly and work together, we can cross the highest pass within 10 days. But I won't make this decision alone. Each family must choose for themselves. Harrison Wells stepped forward immediately. The Wells family votes to continue. Retreat means certain hardship with dwindling supplies. Forward means at least the possibility of reaching Oregon before winter fully sets in. Others voiced their agreement. The Chen brothers, the Miller family, several others all committed to pushing ahead despite the risks. But some were more hesitant. What about the children? Martha Wells asked, her voice surprisingly strong. The elderly, those who might not survive if we're caught in a blizzard. Frederick acknowledged her concern with a nod. Mr. Winters has proposed an alternative route for those who prefer a more cautious approach. It's longer but avoids the highest elevations where snow will be deepest. Eleanor glanced at Winters in surprise. He had already spoken to Frederick about his plan. Two groups, Harrison Wells objected. Dividing our resources and manpower when we need them most. That's madness. Not dividing, Winters corrected, adapting to different needs. The alternative route would be suitable for families with young children, the elderly, or those who simply prefer caution over speed. Frederick surveyed the gathered families. Those who wish to take the main route with me will leave at first light tomorrow. Those who prefer the alternative route will depart an hour later under Mr. Winters' guidance. We will reunite in Oregon. As the meeting broke up, families clustered in urgent discussion about which path to choose. Eleanor made her way back to the Washburn wagon, her mind racing with the implications of this unexpected development. Gabriel Winters was waiting for her. You'll take the alternative route, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. The decision was clear in Eleanor's mind. The twins' safety has to be my priority. The Washburn sisters have also decided to join us. And the Peterson family with their young boys. Winters seemed pleased. We'll be a small party, but that means greater flexibility and faster travel when conditions allow. Eleanor nodded, already mentally preparing for this new arrangement. What about supplies? My share from the communal stores won't last long. I've spoken to Frederick about that. He's allocated extra provisions for our group, especially for the twins. Winters glanced toward the center of the camp where Frederick was still deep in conversation with several men. He may seem distant, Eleanor, but he cares about his sons. I know. Eleanor had seen the way Frederick sometimes watched the twins from a distance, his expression a complex mixture of grief and longing. He's doing what he thinks is best for them, even if it means entrusting them to others. As darkness fell and the snow continued its gentle descent, Eleanor helped the Washburn sisters prepare for the next day's journey. They would need to reorganize their wagon, determining what was essential and what could be left behind to make room for additional supplies. She was sorting through medical items when Martha Wells approached, her face partially hidden by the hood of her cloak. Mrs. Hayes, Martha said softly, glancing around as if to ensure they weren't observed. May I speak with you privately? Surprised, Eleanor led her a short distance from the wagon. What is it, Mrs. Wells? Martha seemed to struggle with herself before speaking. Harrison doesn't know I'm here. He would be furious if he knew. She took a deep breath. I want you to take Lily with you on the alternative route. Eleanor stared at her in shock. Your daughter, but surely you and Mr. Wells. Harrison insists we continue with Captain Morgan. He says retreating or taking the longer route shows weakness. Martha's voice shook slightly. But I fear for Lily. She's not strong like our boys were. If we're caught in a blizzard. The pain in Martha's eyes was unmistakable, the fear of losing another child, of reliving the grief that had driven them west in the first place. Mrs. Wells, Eleanor said gently, I understand your concern, but separating Lily from you and her father, Harrison will never agree to the safer route. His pride won't allow it. Martha clasped Eleanor's hands, her own cold, even through her gloves. Please, Mrs. Hayes, I would go with her if I could, but Harrison would never permit it. At least this way one of us might survive if the worst happens. The desperation in Martha's plea struck Eleanor deeply. Here was another mother forced to make an impossible choice for her child's safety, just as Rebecca had been. Does Lily understand what you're asking? Martha nodded. She's afraid, but she understands. She's fond of you and of the twins. Eleanor thought of the solemn little girl who had become a frequent visitor, whose rigid posture and careful speech spoke of a childhood bound by strict expectations. Perhaps some time away from Harrison's stern influence would be good for her. Very well, Eleanor agreed. But you must speak to Mr. Winters about the arrangements, and you should know that Dr. Clark will be traveling with Captain Morgan's group. Relief flooded Martha's face. Thank you. I'll bring Lily to your wagon before dawn with her belongings. She hesitated, then added, Mrs. Hayes, whatever you may think of Harrison and me, we did love our sons. We do love Lily. We just show it differently than you might. As Martha hurried away, Eleanor was left pondering the complexities of love and protection and the different forms they took in different families. Harrison Wells might be controlling and calculating, but perhaps even his schemes to acquire the twins stemmed from genuine grief over his lost sons. The realization didn't excuse his actions, but it helped Eleanor understand them. And understanding was the first step toward compassion, a quality she would need in abundance for the journey ahead. Dawn broke clear and cold, the night snowfall clinging to the pine trees surrounding the camp. The wagon train was already in motion, families making final preparations for departure. The air hummed with tension as travelers committed to their chosen paths. Eleanor stood beside the Washburn wagon, supervising as Gabriel Winters secured extra supplies provided by Frederick Morgan. The twins slept peacefully in their new cradle, bundled against the mountain chill. Most families are staying with the main train, Winters reported, tying down a barrel of flour. Besides us, only the Petersons, the Washburns, and the Jensen widow have chosen the alternative route. And Lily Wells, Eleanor added, explaining Martha's nocturnal visit. Winters raised an eyebrow. Wells agreed to this. Not exactly. Martha is sending Lily with us without his knowledge. Eleanor glanced toward the Wells wagon where Harrison was directing the loading of supplies with his usual precision. She fears for Lily's safety on the more treacherous route. Interesting. Winters secured the last rope. Wells won't be pleased when he discovers his daughter is missing. By then we'll be on separate paths. Eleanor checked the twins once more, adjusting their blankets. Martha will bring Lily before the main train departs. But as the hour of departure approached, there was no sign of Martha or Lily. Eleanor watched anxiously as families gathered to bid farewell to those taking different routes. Frederick Morgan moved through the crowd, checking final preparations and offering stoic encouragement. When he reached the Washburn wagon, he paused, his gaze falling on the sleeping twins. Mrs. Hayes, he acknowledged with a nod, when Winters tells me you've chosen the alternative route. Yes, Captain Morgan. I believe it's safer for the twins. Frederick's expression was unreadable as he looked at his sons. You've cared for them well, he said after a moment. Better than I could have. Rebecca would be pleased. The unexpected acknowledgement caught Eleanor off guard. Thank you. Frederick reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch. This is for the Poys, their mother's locket and my family Bible, things they should have when they're older. Eleanor accepted the pouch, touched by this gesture from a man who had remained emotionally distant since his wife's death. I'll keep them safe until the boys are old enough to understand their value. Frederick nodded, seeming to struggle with something more he wanted to say. Finally, he simply touched each twin's head gently and turned away. As the main wagon train prepared to depart, Eleanor's anxiety grew. Where were Martha and Lily? Had Harrison discovered their plan? Her answer came in the form of Gabriel Winters hurrying toward their wagon, his expression grim. Wells knows, he said without preamble. He found Lily's packed bag and confronted Martha. He's keeping them both under watch until the train departs. Eleanor felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Poor Lily, and poor Martha trying to protect her daughter the only way she could. Wells is determined that no one he considers his will escape his control. Winters said, his voice hard. Not his wife, not his daughter, and certainly not the twins he still believes should be his. As if summoned by their discussion, Harrison Wells appeared at the edge of the clearing, his tall figure unmistakable, even at a distance. He stared at their small party for a long moment before turning away to join the main train, now beginning its departure. Eleanor watched the procession of wagons with mixed emotions. Relief that she had chosen the safer route for the twins, concern for Lily and Martha left under Harrison's strict control, and an unexpected sadness at parting from the larger community that had been her world for months. They'll be fine, Winters said, correctly interpreting her expression. Morgan is a good leader, and most of the families are well prepared, and we'll reach Oregon safely on our route. We will. Winters' confidence was reassuring. It will take longer, but we'll avoid the worst of the mountain weather. Their own smaller party departed an hour later, 5 wagons in total, following the alternative path Winters had mapped. The trail immediately diverged from the main route, winding around the base of a towering peak, rather than attempting to cross it. Eleanor sat beside Beatrice Washburn as their wagon jolted along the narrow trail. The twins, awake now, watched the swaying canvas above them with unfocused curiosity. I think Samuel smiled at me this morning, Beatrice said, gently tickling the smaller twin's chin. A real smile, not just gas. Eleanor laughed. At 6 weeks, that would be early. Mark my words, Beatrice insisted. These boys are advanced for their age. Must be all the adventure they've had already. The first day on the alternative route passed uneventfully, the weather remaining clear though bitterly cold. They made camp in a sheltered grove of pines, the 5 wagons drawn close together for protection. That night, as Eleanor sat beside their small fire feeding Joshua Gabriel, Winters joined her, offering a tin cup of hot coffee. The Jensens reported seeing fresh bear tracks about a mile back, he said conversationally. I've organized a watch rotation for tonight. I'll take the first shift. Eleanor accepted the coffee gratefully. Do you think there's real danger? Bears are usually more afraid of us than we are of them, but with winter approaching, they're hungry and preparing to hibernate. Winters poked at the fire. Best to be cautious. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the crackling fire, and Joshua's contented nursing sounds the only interruption. Eleanor found herself studying Winters' profile, noting the lines of weariness around his eyes, the streak of gray at his temple that hadn't been there when they first met. You should rest, she said. You've been driving all day, and now you're taking watch. Winters smiled slightly. I'm accustomed to little sleep. Army habits die hard, like keeping promises to fallen comrades. The words slipped out before Eleanor could reconsider them. Winters looked at her sharply. Jonathan was more than a comrade. He was my friend, one of the few true friends I've had. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound ungrateful. Eleanor shifted Joshua to her shoulder, patting his back gently. I wonder sometimes what your life would be like if you hadn't felt obligated to follow me west. Not obligated, Winters corrected. Honored. Jonathan saved my life. Watching over you and now these boys? He gestured toward Joshua. It's the most worthwhile thing I've done since leaving the Army. And there was a sincerity in his voice that touched Eleanor deeply. Still, when we reach Oregon, you'll be free to pursue your own path. Your promise will be fulfilled. Winters was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. And what will you do in Oregon, Eleanor? A widow with twin boys in a new territory? The question was one Eleanor had been avoiding. In the immediacy of daily survival, the distant future had seemed an abstract concern, but now separated from the main wagon train and following a path of their own, choosing the reality of what awaited in Oregon became more pressing. I'll establish a medical practice, she said, thinking aloud. There will be need for someone with my skills in the new settlements. I'll build a home for the boys, educate them as best I can. Alone. The single word hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Eleanor wasn't ready to consider. She busied herself with settling the now sleeping Joshua in his cradle. "I've managed alone since Jonathan died," she finally said. "I'll continue to manage." Winters nodded, accepting her indirect answer without pressing further. "You should get some sleep. Tomorrow's trail will be challenging." As he moved away to begin his watch, Eleanor found herself strangely unsettled by their conversation. Gabriel Winters had become an essential part of her daily life, her protector, her ally, the one person who truly understood the complex circumstances that had brought her to this moment. What would it mean when that partnership ended, as it inevitably must when they reached Oregon? The question followed her into uneasy dreams, where she searched endless mountain trails for something vital she had lost, only to wake with a start when Samuel began to cry for his midnight feeding. The next 3 days brought steadily worsening weather. Snow fell intermittently, never heavily enough to block the trail completely, but accumulating with each passing hour. The temperature dropped sharply, forcing the small party to travel shorter distances each day and spend more time huddled around their fires each night. Eleanor developed a routine for keeping the twins warm despite the harsh conditions. She heated stones in the campfire, then wrapped them in blankets and placed them in the cradle, creating a warm nest that protected the infants from the worst of the cold. She fashioned tiny mittens from scraps of wool, donated by Agnes Jensen, and caps that covered the baby's ears and tied securely under their chins. Despite these precautions, Samuel developed a worrying cough on the 4th night. Eleanor stayed awake with him, monitoring his breathing and applying warm compresses to his chest as he fussed uncomfortably. Herbal steam might help, Beatrice suggested, boiling water over their small fire. "My mother used pine needles and mint for chest complaints." Eleanor was willing to try anything. She held Samuel over the steaming pot, creating a tent with a blanket to trap the aromatic vapors around him. To her relief, his breathing eased after several minutes of this treatment, and by morning his cough had subsided. But the incident served as a stark reminder of the twins' vulnerability. They were not yet 2 months old, born prematurely, and now subjected to conditions that would challenge even the healthiest adult. Eleanor found herself constantly checking them, counting their breaths, touching their foreheads for signs of fever. Gabriel Winters noticed her increased vigilance. "You need rest," he told her on the 5th evening as they made camp beside a half-frozen stream. "You're no good to them exhausted." "I'm fine," Eleanor insisted, though the dark circles under her eyes told a different story. "You're not." Winters took Samuel from her arms, cradling the infant with surprising gentleness. "Go sleep for a few hours. I'll watch them." Too tired to argue, Eleanor retreated to the Washburn wagon. She meant to rest only briefly, but exhaustion claimed her immediately, and when she woke, pale morning light was filtering through the canvas cover. She sat up with a jolt. "The twins are perfectly fine," Beatrice assured her, already dressed and preparing breakfast. "Mr. Winters took excellent care of them all night." Samuel didn't cough once. Eleanor scrambled from her bedroll, hurrying outside to find Gabriel seated beside the fire, both twins nestled in his lap. Joshua was awake, staring with apparent fascination at Winters' bearded face. Samuel slept peacefully, one tiny hand curled around Winters' finger. "You should have woken me," Eleanor said, though the sight of the 2 infants so contentedly situated made it hard to maintain her indignation. "You needed the rest." Winters carefully transferred Joshua to her arms. "And I needed the practice." "Practice," a slight flush colored his cheeks. "In caring for them. If I'm to help you reach Oregon safely, I should know how to tend to them if you're indisposed." The practical logic was undeniable, yet Eleanor sensed something more in his careful attention to the twins and the natural way he held Samuel against his chest. Gabriel Winters was forming his own attachment to these children, one that went beyond his promise to Jonathan or his role as their protector on the trail. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting to know the twins had another adult who cared for them so deeply. Unsettling to recognize how quickly they were becoming a unit, Eleanor, the twins, and Gabriel, that felt dangerously like a family. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to articulate the complex emotions swirling within her, "for watching over them." Winters met her gaze steadily. "Always," he replied, and Eleanor understood he meant far more than just the previous night. The moment was interrupted by Jacob Peterson approaching their fire, his expression grave. "Mr. Winters, we have a problem. The Jensen wagon lost a wheel on the slope back there. Axle might be cracked too. Winters carefully handed Samuel to Eleanor before standing. How bad? Bad enough. We can repair it, but it'll take most of the day. And with this weather. Peterson glanced at the leaden sky above where fresh snow clouds were gathering. We make camp here for the day, Winters decided. Use the time to rest the oxen and reinforce the wagons against the cold. We'll start again tomorrow if the weather permits. As the men departed to assist with the Jensen wagon, Eleanor settled beside the fire with the twins. The enforced delay was concerning. Every day spent stationary was another day of depleting their limited supplies, but it also provided a welcome opportunity to properly care for Samuel and Joshua without the constant jolting of wagon travel. Beatrice joined her, bringing a pot of hot porridge. Silver linings, the older woman said cheerfully. A day of rest will do us all good. If the snow holds off, Eleanor agreed, eyeing the threatening sky. But the snow didn't hold off. By midday, fat flakes were falling, steadily accumulating on the ground and on the canvas covers of their wagons. By evening, a full inch had fallen, and the temperature dropped precipitously as darkness approached. The small party gathered in the largest wagon, the Petersons, for the night meal, sharing warmth and companionship as the storm intensified outside. The twins fed and changed, slept in their cradle near the small stove that heated the wagon's interior. How much further to Oregon? Young Michael Peterson asked, his eyes wide, as he listened to the wind howling outside. Another 2 weeks if the weather improves, Gabriel Winters replied, accepting a bowl of stew from Mrs. Peterson. Maybe 3. And the main train, will they reach Oregon before us? Winters exchanged a glance with Eleanor. If they made it through the high pass before this storm hit, yes. If not, he didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone in the wagon understood the implications. If Frederick Morgan's larger party had been caught in this same storm while crossing the highest, most exposed section of the mountain range, their situation would be far more perilous than the relative comfort that this smaller group now enjoyed. We should say a prayer for them, Agnes Jensen suggested, and heads bowed as she offered a simple petition for the safety of their fellow travelers. Eleanor found herself thinking specifically of Lily and Martha Wells trapped not only in the potential physical danger of the storm, but in the emotional chill of Harrison's controlling presence, and of Frederick, who had entrusted his sons to her care while he led the larger group toward an uncertain fate. They'll be fine, Beatrice whispered, noting Eleanor's troubled expression. Frederick Morgan knows these mountains. He wouldn't risk the entire train if he wasn't confident they could make it through. Eleanor nodded, trying to take comfort in Beatrice's optimism. But as the evening progressed and the storm continued to strengthen, her unease grew. By the time they retired to their separate wagons for the night, snow was falling so heavily that footprints disappeared within minutes. Sleep proved elusive as Eleanor lay in her bedroll, listening to the wind's mournful howl and the creaking of the wagon as it rocked in stronger gusts. The twins, perhaps sensing her anxiety, were unusually restless, waking frequently with whimpers that escalated to full cries if not immediately attended to. Shortly after midnight, a particularly violent gust shook the wagon so forcefully that Eleanor feared it might overturn. She sat up, reaching instinctively for the twins when the canvas flap at the rear of the wagon opened, admitting a swirl of snow and a heavily bundled figure. Eleanor, Gabriel Winters' voice was barely audible above the storm. We need to move the wagons. The wind is getting too strong on this exposed slope. Move in this? Eleanor gestured toward the raging blizzard visible through the opening. There's a rock formation about half a mile ahead. I scouted it yesterday. It will provide shelter from the worst of the wind. Winter's face was ghostly in the dim light of the small oil lamp Eleanor had kept burning. If we stay here, we risk the wagons being overturned or buried. The urgency in his voice convinced Eleanor more than his words. She quickly bundled the twins in their warmest blankets, securing them inside her coat where her body heat would protect them from the bitter cold. Beatrice and her sister were already awake, pulling on layers of clothing with trembling hands. This is worse than the blizzard of 31, Edith Washburn muttered. Never thought I'd see its like again. Outside, the storm's full fury became apparent. Snow swirled in blinding sheets driven horizontally by winds that cut through Eleanor's clothing like knives. She could barely make out the shapes of the other wagons, though they were only yards away. Winters led her to the Peterson wagon where the entire small party was gathering. We'll hitch all the teams to the 2 sturdiest wagons, the Petersons and the Jensens, he explained, practically shouting to be heard over the wind. Everyone rides inside those 2. We leave the other wagons secured here and come back for them when the storm passes. There were no arguments. Even the Washburn sisters, normally so protective of their possessions, recognized the life-or-death nature of their situation. Within 20 minutes, the teams were hitched and the travelers crowded into the two remaining wagons, bringing only what they could carry. Eleanor found herself in the Peterson wagon, wedged between Mrs. Peterson and Beatrice Washburn, the twins still secured inside her coat. Gabriel took the reins himself, with Jacob Peterson beside him to help control the frightened oxen. The journey that Winters had estimated at half a mile seemed to take hours. The oxen fought against the wind and snow, making painfully slow progress along a trail that had vanished beneath white drifts. Several times the wagon wheels became stuck, requiring the men to climb down and push, while the women urged the straining animals forward. Eleanor held the twins close, whispering reassurances they couldn't possibly understand, but that somehow calmed her own racing heart. They were remarkably quiet, as if sensing the gravity of the situation. Just when it seemed they must have missed their destination, a dark shape loomed ahead, the rock formation Winters had promised. It rose from the snow-covered ground like the hull of an enormous ship, creating a natural windbreak on its leeward side. The wagons were positioned in the shelter of the rocks, where the howling wind immediately diminished to a more manageable moan. The oxen, exhausted from their battle with the elements, were unhitched and brought around to the most protected side, where blankets were thrown over them for additional warmth. Inside the wagon, the travelers huddled together for warmth, too exhausted and cold for conversation. Eleanor checked the twins, anxiously relieved to find them both sleeping peacefully, apparently unaffected by their perilous journey. "You should sleep," Winters told her, his voice hoarse from shouting against the wind. "We're safe enough here until the storm passes." Eleanor nodded, too tired to argue. She settled against the wagon's side, the twins cradled securely in her arms, and felt herself drifting almost immediately into an exhausted slumber. She woke to silence. The wind's howl had ceased, and the wagon was filled with pale gray light filtering through the canvas cover. For a moment, Eleanor lay still, confused by the unfamiliar quiet after so many hours of raging storm. Then Samuel stirred against her chest, making the small grunting sounds that presaged hunger and reality returned. The storm had passed. They had survived. Carefully shifting Joshua, who still slept, Eleanor sat up. The wagon was empty, save for Mrs. Peterson and her youngest son, both sleeping soundly across from her. The canvas flap at the rear was tied open, revealing a world transformed. Snow covered everything, pristine and dazzling in the morning light. Drifts had formed against the rock formation, some taller than a man, sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes. The sky above was a clear, hard blue, as if the storm had never been. Eleanor wrapped Samuel more securely and made her way outside, blinking in the brilliant sunlight reflected off the snow. Gabriel Winters stood a short distance away, conferring with Jacob Peterson and Agnes Jensen. They turned at her approach. "Good morning," Winters greeted her, his exhausted face breaking into a relieved smile. "How are the twins?" "Hungry, but otherwise fine," Eleanor replied, shifting Samuel as he began to fuss more insistently. "How bad was it?" The three exchanged glances. 3 feet of snow in most places," Peterson said. "Drifts twice that in others. The trail is completely buried." "Can we retrieve the other wagons?" Winters nodded. "That's what we're discussing. Peterson and I will go back with 2 teams. The snow is deep but powdery. The oxen should be able to manage. And then, do we continue forward?" Another exchange glance, this one more troubled. "That's the question," Winters admitted. "The snow will make travel extremely difficult, perhaps impossible in some sections." "But if we stay here," Eleanor pressed, "we have supplies for perhaps 2 weeks," Agnes Jensen said. After that, the implication was clear. They would starve if they remained in one place too long, yet attempting to travel through such deep snow carried its own risks. "We'll make that decision after we retrieve the wagons," Winters said firmly. "For now, let's focus on getting everyone back together and properly sheltered." As the men departed with the ox teams, Eleanor returned to the wagon to feed the now fully awake and demanding twins. The Washburn sisters had prepared a small fire in the shelter of the rocks, where they were heating water for tea and porridge. "A miracle we all survived," Edith commented, stirring the bubbling pot. "I've seen strong men lost in storms half as fierce." "It was Mr. Winters' quick thinking," Beatrice added. Knowing about those rocks saved us all. Eleanor nodded, adjusting Samuel at her breast. I wonder how the main train fared. The sisters exchanged concerned looks. They were headed for the highest pass, Beatrice said quietly. If this storm caught them there, she didn't need to finish. They all knew that exposure on the high mountain passes during such a blizzard could be fatal. Perhaps they turned back when they saw the storm approaching, Eleanor suggested, though she knew Frederick Morgan was not a man to retreat easily. Perhaps, Beatrice agreed without much conviction. The day passed slowly as they waited for the men to return with the abandoned wagons. Eleanor kept busy caring for the twins, who seemed mercifully unaffected by the previous night's drama. Joshua, always the hardier of the two, nursed vigorously and then slept contentedly in the makeshift cradle the Washburn sisters had constructed from a wooden box. Samuel, though still smaller and more delicate, showed no signs of the respiratory distress that had worried Eleanor earlier in their journey. By late afternoon, the men had returned with all three abandoned wagons, a feat that impressed even Agnes Jensen, who rarely offered praise. The wagons were positioned in a tight semicircle against the rock formation, creating a protected courtyard where a communal fire could be maintained. As darkness approached, the small party gathered around this fire to discuss their options. The snow is too deep for the wagons to proceed safely, Winters reported. Even with all our teams combined, we'd make perhaps a mile a day, and we'd risk losing animals to exhaustion or injury. So we're trapped here, young Michael Peterson asked, his eyes wide with fear. Not trapped, Winters corrected gently. Just delayed. The snow will compact over time, making travel easier. And as we move to lower elevations, we'll find less snow. How long a delay? Agnes Jensen pressed, always practical. Winters considered this. A week, perhaps two, if there are additional storms. And our supplies, Jacob Peterson voiced the concern they all shared. If we ration carefully, we have enough for 3 weeks. Winters glanced at Eleanor. The twins complicate matters. They need proper nutrition if they're to survive. Eleanor felt all eyes turned to her and the infants. She straightened her spine, refusing to become the weak link in their chain of survival. Samuel and Joshua require very little food compared to adults. Their needs won't significantly impact our supplies. It's not just food, Agnes Jensen pointed out. It's warmth, extra hands to care for them, the space they occupy in the wagons. Eleanor felt a flash of anger. If you're suggesting... No one is suggesting anything, Winters interrupted firmly. We travel together, we survive together. The twins are part of our party, and we will ensure they reach Oregon safely along with everyone else. His decisive tone ended that line of discussion, but Eleanor knew the concern remained. In survival situations, the most vulnerable were always at greatest risk, not necessarily from deliberate abandonment, but from the harsh mathematics of limited resources. We should send someone ahead, Jacob Peterson suggested. Someone who can travel quickly through the snow and reach the nearest settlement. They could return with supplies, maybe additional animals. All eyes turned to Gabriel Winters, the obvious choice for such a mission. He was the strongest among them, the most experienced in wilderness travel, and the one with the most accurate knowledge of what lay ahead. Eleanor felt her heart constrict at the thought of Winters setting out alone into the snow-covered wilderness. If something happened to him, if he became lost or injured, their small party would lose not only their best hope for rescue, but also their most capable protector. Winters seemed to read her thoughts. I'll go, he said, but not immediately. We should wait a few days, see if the snow compacts naturally, and if any additional storms develop. In the meantime, we'll build more permanent shelters and organize our supplies for a potentially extended stay. The decision made the group disperse to their wagons for the night, spirits subdued but not defeated. Eleanor found herself lingering by the fire, the twins sleeping peacefully in her arms, reluctant to leave the circle of light and warmth for the cold isolation of the Washburn wagon. Gabriel Winters remained as well, adding logs to the fire with methodical precision. You should rest, he told her, not looking up from his task. Tomorrow will be difficult. So will the day you leave, Eleanor replied, surprising herself with the directness of her concern. Winters stilled, then carefully placed another log on the fire before responding. I'm not eager to leave you, any of you, he amended quickly, but it may be the only way to ensure everyone's survival. I know, it's the logical choice. Eleanor looked down at the sleeping twins, but logic offers little comfort when faced with the prospect of losing someone important. The word was inadequate, but Eleanor couldn't bring herself to use any of the alternatives that rose to her mind. Friend, protector, partner. Winters moved to sit beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body through the cold night air. "I have no intention of being lost," he said quietly. "I have too much to return to." His gaze, when it met hers, held a question Eleanor wasn't ready to answer. Instead, she carefully transferred Joshua to his arms, using the baby as a bridge between them, a safe connection that required no declarations or commitments. "They trust you," she observed as Joshua settled contentedly against Winter's chest without waking. "Children can sense good hearts, or they're simply accustomed to my voice." Winters looked down at the infant with undisguised affection. "I've been with them nearly every day since their birth. More than their own father," Eleanor noted, thinking of Frederick Morgan's distant relationship with his sons. Frederick made the choice he thought necessary for their survival. Winter's tone held no judgment. "As we all must do." The implication hung in the air between them. If Winters left to seek help, if he didn't return, Eleanor would face the same impossible choice Frederick had, prioritizing the twins' survival even at the cost of personal connection. "We should sleep," Eleanor said, finally taking Joshua back into her arms. "As you said, tomorrow will be difficult." As she made her way to the Washburn wagon, Eleanor felt the weight of unspoken words between them, a conversation postponed but not avoided. Sooner or later they would have to acknowledge what had been building since that first recognition on the banks of the Missouri River, a connection that went beyond Gabriel's promise to Jonathan or Eleanor's gratitude for his protection. But not tonight. Tonight the focus had to remain on survival. No. The next 5 days established a new routine for the stranded travelers. The men constructed more permanent shelters using branches from nearby pine trees, wagon canvas, and packed snow. These rough structures arranged in a semicircle around the central fire provided better insulation than the wagons alone. Eleanor and the twins shared a shelter with the Washburn sisters, who had become deeply attached to the infants. Beatrice proved particularly helpful with Samuel, whose delicate constitution still concerned Eleanor. The older woman seemed to have an intuitive understanding of when the smaller twin needed extra warmth or a specific position to ease his breathing. "I was a nursemaid in my youth," Beatrice explained when Eleanor commented on her skill. "Before Edith and I opened our school, I helped raise a dozen children for various families." "You never had children of your own?" Eleanor asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. Beatrice smiled gently. "The opportunity never arose, but I've never lacked for little ones to love." She tickled Samuel's chin, eliciting a definite smile. "See, he knows a kindred spirit when he meets one." The snow compacted somewhat, but remained too deep for wagon travel. Gabriel Winters and Jacob Peterson made several scouting expeditions, returning with reports of slightly better conditions at lower elevations, but still impassable sections along their intended route. On the evening of the 5th day, as the small party gathered around their fire for the communal meal, Winters announced his decision. "I'll leave tomorrow at first light. Traveling alone, I can make better time through the difficult sections. According to my calculations, I can reach Jenkins' trading post within 4 days." Eleanor felt her stomach clench with anxiety, though she had been expecting this announcement. Jenkins' trading post was the nearest outpost of civilization, a small but well-supplied way station for travelers crossing the mountains. From there, Winters could organize a relief party to bring supplies back to their stranded group. 4 days there, 4 back, Agnes Jensen calculated aloud, plus whatever time it takes to arrange supplies and assistance. At minimum, we're looking at 10 days before help arrives. Possibly longer, Winters acknowledged, which is why strict rationing must continue, and why you must be prepared for the possibility that I might not return before another storm hits. The stark reality of their situation settled over the group. Even with Winter's departure, they faced at least 10 more days in their improvised camp with limited supplies and the constant threat of winter weather. "We'll manage," Jacob Peterson said, with more confidence than his expressions suggested. "The real question is what happens if you encounter difficulties on your journey. I've prepared for that possibility." Winters reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, his map of the mountain passes. "This shows our current position and the route to Jenkins' trading post. If I haven't returned within 14 days, Peterson should lead the group forward, following this path and assuming the snow has compacted enough for travel." The discussion continued, addressing practical details of Winter's journey and the group's contingency plans, but Eleanor found herself unable to focus. The prospect of Winters setting out alone into the snow-covered wilderness filled her with a dread that seemed disproportionate to their brief acquaintance. Yet was it truly so brief? In the intense conditions of the trail, relationships formed and deepened at an accelerated pace. She had known Gabriel Winters for less than 3 months, yet he had become essential to her in a way few people ever had. After the others had retired to their shelters, Eleanor remained by the fire, the twins sleeping nearby in their cradle. She wasn't surprised when Winters joined her, carrying additional logs for the fire. "You should rest," he said, the familiar refrain now weighted with the knowledge of his imminent departure. "So should you. You have a difficult journey ahead." Winters arranged the logs, carefully building the fire higher against the bitter night cold. "I prepared as best I can. Peterson gave me his snowshoes, which will help with the deeper drifts. Agnes contributed her husband's compass. The Washburns insisted I take extra mittens." "And what can I contribute?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Winters looked up the firelight, casting his face in sharp relief. "A reason to return safely." The simple statement, or delivered without drama or expectation, broke through Eleanor's carefully maintained composure. "Gabriel," she said, using his given name for the first time. "I don't." He shook his head. "Not now, not as a farewell or out of fear. If there's something to be said between us, it should wait until I return. And if you don't return, then it wasn't meant to be said." He moved to sit beside her, close but not touching. "Eleanor, I made a promise to Jonathan to watch over you, but what I feel now has nothing to do with that promise. It would be unfair to both of us to explore those feelings under the shadow of possible separation." Eleanor understood his reasoning, even appreciated his restraint, yet something in her rebelled against leaving so much unspoken. "Then let me say only this," she offered. "The twins and I will be waiting for your return, not out of obligation or necessity, but because you have become important to us. Essential even." Impon, it wasn't a declaration of love, they weren't ready for that, but it was an acknowledgement of possibility of a future that might include more than just survival. Winters nodded, accepting her words with the same quiet dignity that characterized all his actions. That's reason enough to return through any storm. They sat together in companionable silence until the fire burned low, each lost in private thoughts about the challenges ahead. When Eleanor finally rose to retire to her shelter, Winters stood as well. "I'll be gone before dawn," he said. "Best not to prolong goodbyes." Eleanor nodded, understanding his preference. "Godspeed, Gabriel Winters. We'll be looking for your return." As she turned to leave, Winters reached out his hand, catching hers briefly. The touch was fleeting, warm fingers against cold, but it conveyed more than words could have. Then he released her, and Eleanor made her way to her shelter, where the twins slept peacefully, unaware of the tenuous thread upon which their futures now hung. True to his word, Gabriel Winters was gone when Eleanor emerged from her shelter at first light. The only signs of his departure were footprints in the snow, already beginning to fill with the light dusting that had fallen overnight. Life in the small encampment took on a subdued rhythm in Winter's absence. Each day followed a similar pattern, tending fires, caring for livestock, preparing meager meals from their dwindling supplies, and watching the weather with anxious eyes. The children, the Peterson boys and the twins, provided the only real distraction from the grim calculations of survival. Eleanor found herself constantly counting days, marking each sunrise as one day closer to Winter's possible return. By the 4th day, she caught herself scanning the horizon whenever she stepped outside, though she knew it was too soon to expect him. On the 5th day, Samuel developed a fever. It began subtly, a slight warmth to his skin, a listlessness Eleanor might have attributed to hunger if she hadn't been so attuned to his every reaction. By evening, there was no denying the infant was ill. "We need to cool him," Eleanor instructed Beatrice, who hovered anxiously nearby. "Damp cloths, not too cold. And he needs more fluids than usual." Together they worked through the night, taking turns holding the feverish baby and applying cool compresses to his forehead and chest. By morning, Samuel's temperature had risen further, and his breathing had become labored. "Could it be pneumonia?" Beatrice asked, her lined face tight with worry. Eleanor feared the same, but was reluctant to voice it. Pneumonia in an infant this young in these conditions with limited medical supplies, the prognosis would be grave. It could be any number of things, she said instead. A simple cold that his small body is fighting harder than necessary. A reaction to the altitude. But as the day progressed, Samuel's condition worsened. His cries became weak and intermittent, his skin hot and dry, despite their efforts to cool him. Joshua, separated from his twin for the first time since birth, fussed constantly, as if sensing his brother's distress. Word of Samuel's illness spread quickly through the small camp. Agnes Jensen contributed precious honey to mix with water for the baby's hydration. Jacob Peterson ventured into the snow to search for pine needles that might be brewed into a decoction for respiratory ailments. By nightfall, Eleanor was frantic with worry. Samuel now lay limply in her arms, his breathing shallow and rapid, his tiny body burning with fever. Every remedy she knew had been tried and had failed. Without proper medicines, without a doctor's knowledge beyond her own limited training, she was watching Rebecca's son slip away. Gabriel will be back soon, Beatrice reminded her as they sat together in their shelter, the ailing infant between them. Perhaps as early as tomorrow. He might bring a doctor or medicines. Samuel doesn't have until tomorrow, Eleanor whispered, voicing her deepest fear. He's growing weaker by the hour. Then we pray, Beatrice said simply, taking Eleanor's free hand in her own gnarled one. We pray for a miracle. Eleanor had never been particularly religious, but in that moment she found herself joining Beatrice in desperate prayer. She prayed for Samuel's survival, for Gabriel's swift return, for strength to face whatever outcome awaited. As the night deepened, Samuel's condition stabilized somewhat. His fever neither broke nor worsened, and his breathing, while still labored, maintained a steady rhythm. Eleanor refused to leave his side, passing Joshua to Beatrice when he needed feeding, but keeping Samuel cradled against her chest, monitoring every subtle change in his condition. Somewhere in the coldest hours before dawn, exhaustion finally claimed her. Eleanor slipped into a restless sleep, Samuel held securely in her arms, her last conscious thought, a continuation of her earlier prayer. Please, please let him live. She woke to movement at the entrance of their shelter. Morning light filtered through the opening, accompanied by a rush of cold air and a familiar voice. Eleanor. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. Gabriel Winters couldn't possibly have returned so soon. But as her vision cleared, she saw him kneeling at the entrance, his face haggard from his journey but undeniably real. Gabriel. Eleanor struggled to sit up, careful not to disturb Samuel, who still slept against her chest. How? I met a relief party from the main train, he explained quickly. They were searching for us. Morgan sent them when they reached safer territory. His gaze fell on Samuel, and his expression tightened with concern. The baby is ill. Fever. Possible pneumonia. Eleanor could barely form complete sentences through her shock and relief. Gabriel, he's very sick. Winters turned and spoke to someone behind him, and to Eleanor's astonishment, Martha Wells entered the shelter, followed by a man Eleanor didn't recognize. This is Dr. Wilson, Martha explained, moving immediately to Eleanor's side to examine Samuel. He was traveling with another wagon train that joined ours in the valley. Frederick sent him with the relief party. The doctor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, knelt beside Eleanor. May I? He asked, holding out his hands for Samuel. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before surrendering the infant. Dr. Wilson examined Samuel thoroughly, listening to his chest with a stethoscope, checking his temperature, testing his reflexes. Bronchial pneumonia, he confirmed when he had finished. Serious but not hopeless. I have medicines that may help. He returned to the relief party's wagons and came back with a black bag from which he produced several bottles and packets. Quinine for the fever, a mustard plaster for his chest, very mild for one so young. And this, he held up a small blue bottle, is a preparation of my own design for respiratory ailments. It contains ipecacuanha and a small amount of opium to ease his breathing. Eleanor watched anxiously as the doctor administered the first doses of medicine, preparing the mustard plaster with Martha's assistance and applying it gently to Samuel's chest. He's very strong for one born so early, Dr. Wilson commented as he worked. Both twins are from what Mrs. Wells tells me. You've done remarkably well caring for them under such conditions. Will he recover? Eleanor asked, unable to focus on anything but Samuel's prognosis. Dr. Wilson's expression was cautiously optimistic. The next 24 hours will be critical. But yes, I believe he has an excellent chance with proper care and medication. As the doctor continued his treatment, Gabriel Winters explained the current situation. The main train made it through the high pass just before the worst of the blizzard hit. They lost 2 wagons and some livestock, but no lives. They're now camped in a protected valley about 15 miles east of Jenkins' trading post. And Frederick, he's well, Eleanor asked, thinking of the twins' father. He's well, concerned about his sons when he heard we'd been caught in the mountains during the storm. Winters glanced at the twins, Samuel now sleeping more peacefully under the doctor's care, Joshua awake and watching the proceedings with wide eyes. He sent this relief party to find us as soon as it was safe to travel. Martha Wells, who had been quietly assisting the doctor, finally addressed Eleanor directly. Mrs. Hayes, I want to apologize for my husband's behavior, and to thank you for the offer to take Lily with your party. Even though circumstances prevented it, your willingness to protect her meant a great deal to me. Eleanor was startled by the apology. Mrs. Wells, there's no need. There is, Martha insisted. Harrison's obsession with acquiring the twins has caused nothing but pain. But you should know that after the storm, when we feared your party might be lost, he was genuinely distressed. Whatever his flaws, he does care for children in his way. Eleanor didn't know how to respond to this complicated portrait of a man she had come to view as an enemy. Before she could formulate a reply, Dr. Wilson spoke again. The medicine is taking effect, he observed, touching Samuel's forehead. His fever is already slightly reduced, but he'll need careful monitoring and regular doses over the next several days. I can manage that, Eleanor said. I have no doubt. The doctor smiled kindly. But it would be better to move him to the main camp, where I can provide consistent care and where the accommodations are more suitable for a sick infant. Eleanor looked to Gabriel, who nodded. The relief party brought extra wagons and teams. We can leave as soon as everyone is ready. The snow has compacted enough on the main trail to allow careful travel. The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity as the small party prepared to abandon their temporary camp and join the main wagon train. The Washburn sisters packed their belongings with practiced efficiency. The Petersons and Jensens dismantled the shelters they had constructed, salvaging the materials that might be useful later. Eleanor focused solely on the twins, particularly Samuel, whose condition continued to improve under Dr. Wilson's care. The infant's fever had definitely decreased, and his breathing, while still labored, was less desperate than it had been the night before. By midday, they were ready to depart. The relief party had brought 4 wagons with fresh teams, more than enough to transport the stranded travelers and their salvageable possessions. Eleanor rode in the lead wagon with Dr. Wilson, the twins nestled securely between them. Gabriel Winters drove the team, navigating the snow-covered trail with the same steady competence he had demonstrated throughout their journey. As their small caravan made its way down from the mountain shelter that had been their home for nearly a week, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the strange turns her life had taken since leaving St. Louis. The widow who had joined the wagon train seeking a fresh start had found far more than she bargained for 2 children who now depended on her completely, a community that had accepted her medical skills without question, and a man whose presence in her life had grown from obligation to something far more profound. And now, as they descended toward the main camp, where Frederick Morgan waited with the rest of the wagon train, Eleanor faced yet another turning point. Would Frederick, seeing his sons again, reconsider his decision to give them up? Would the relief party's arrival, with its expanded resources and additional helpers, make Eleanor's role as the twins' guardian seem less necessary? She looked down at Samuel, sleeping peacefully now, as the medicine did its work, and at Joshua, who had finally settled after being reunited with his twin. These children were hers now, in every way that mattered. She had fed them, cleaned them, soothed their cries, watched over their sleep. She had fought for their survival against weather, illness, and those who would separate them. Whatever awaited in the main camp, Eleanor knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would not easily surrender the twins to anyone, not even their biological father. As if reading her thoughts, Gabriel spoke from his position at the reins. Frederick won't take them back, he said quietly. That's not why he sent the relief party. How can you be sure? Because I spoke with him before I left to find you. He asked after their welfare, expressed concern for their safety, but made it clear that his decision was final. Winters glanced back at her. They're your sons now, Eleanor, legally and in every other way. The simple statement, delivered with such certainty, eased a tension Eleanor hadn't fully acknowledged. And when we reach Oregon, what then? It was a loaded question addressing far more than just their physical destination. What would happen to the fragile connections formed on this journey once they reached civilization? What would become of the makeshift family that had developed Eleanor, the twins, and Gabrielle? Winters was quiet for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on guiding the team through a particularly deep drift. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful but resolute. When we reach Oregon, you'll establish your medical practice as you planned. The twins will have a proper home, an education, all the opportunities you've envisioned for them. He paused. And if you're amenable, I'll build that home for you beside a proper clinic where you can treat patients, where we can raise the boys together. The proposal for that was what it was beneath its practical packaging took Eleanor's breath away. Not because it was unexpected, but because of its straightforward acceptance of what had been developing between them. Gabriel, she began, uncertain how to respond. You don't need to answer now, he said quickly. It's not a decision to make in haste or under duress. When we reach Oregon, when the twins are healthy and we're all safely settled, then we can discuss what comes next. Eleanor nodded, grateful for his understanding. Yet even as she acknowledged the wisdom of waiting, she found herself already knowing what her answer would be. The thought of raising Samuel and Joshua with Gabriel Winters by her side felt right in a way few things had since Jonathan's death. The remainder of the journey passed in companionable silence, broken only by Dr. Wilson's occasional observations about Samuel's improving condition and Joshua's increasing alertness. By late afternoon, they had descended enough that the snow thinned considerably, making travel easier and faster. As dusk approached, they caught sight of the main camp, dozens of wagons arranged in the familiar circular formation in a sheltered valley. Smoke rose from multiple fires and figures moved about in the last light of day, engaged in the routine tasks of camp life. Eleanor felt a surge of emotion at this reunion with the larger community they had left behind weeks earlier. Despite the challenges and conflicts, these travelers had become a kind of extended family, bound by shared experiences and the common goal of building new lives in Oregon. Gabriel guided their Cheyenne toward the center of the camp, where Frederick Morgan waited alongside several other men. As they drew closer, Eleanor could see the captain's face, clearly still grave, still marked by grief, but somehow less remote than when they had parted. The wagon came to a stop, and for a moment no one moved. Then Frederick stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the bundle in Eleanor's arms where Samuel slept. Mrs. Hayes, he greeted her formally, I'm glad to see you and the twins safely returned. Captain Morgan, Eleanor acknowledged. Your relief party arrived just in time. Samuel has been ill, but Dr. Wilson believes he will recover fully. Frederick nodded, relief visible in his expression. May I see them? Eleanor hesitated only briefly before adjusting the blankets to reveal both infants. Frederick studied them silently, noting the changes that had occurred in the weeks since he had last seen his sons. They were larger now, their features more defined and their personalities beginning to emerge in subtle ways only a caregiver would notice. They're thriving, he said finally. Despite everything, you've kept your promise to Rebecca. I have tried, Eleanor agreed, and will continue to try as long as they're in my care. Frederick seemed to understand the question implicit in her statement. My decision stands, Mrs. Hayes. The legal papers were drawn up before we separated. The twins are officially yours to raise as you see fit. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. This makes it formal under Oregon territorial law. Eleanor accepted the paper, emotion threatening to overwhelm her, as the last uncertainty about the twins' future was removed. Thank you, she managed, for trusting me with them. It's what Rebecca wanted, Frederick said simply, and having seen how you've cared for them under the most difficult circumstances imaginable, I know it was the right choice. The moment was interrupted by Harrison Wells, who approached with Martha and Lily beside him. Eleanor tensed, expecting confrontation, but Wells's expression held none of the hostility she remembered. Mrs. Hayes, he greeted her, his tone formal, but not unfriendly. I understand one of the twins has been ill. I hope he recovers quickly. Thank you, Mr. Wells. Dr. Wilson believes he will. Wells nodded, seeming to struggle with what to say next. Finally, Martha placed a gentle hand on his arm, encouraging him. Mrs. Hayes, I owe you an apology. Wells said the words clearly difficult for him. My behavior regarding the twins was inexcusable. Grief is no justification for the actions I took. Eleanor was speechless, never having expected such an admission from the proud, controlling man she had come to fear. The storm changed many things, Martha explained softly. When we thought your party might be lost, when Harrison realized Lily might have been with you if I had succeeded in sending her, she trailed off, emotion overcoming her. I was forced to confront what my obsession might have cost. Wells finished for his wife. Not just my daughter's life, but my humanity, my sense of right and wrong. Eleanor didn't know how to respond to this transformation. Part of her remained wary, suspicious that this might be another strategy to gain her trust. But the genuine distress in Martha's eyes and the uncharacteristic humility in Harrison's bearing suggested a real change had occurred. Thank you for your apology, Mr. Wells, she finally said. I accept it for the twins' sake as well as my own. Wells nodded once, then turned to Gabriel Winters. Mr. Winters, I believe I owe you an apology as well. Your accusations regarding the wagon incident were correct. It was no accident. Gabriel's expression remained neutral. What's done is done, Mr. Wells. We all survived, which is what matters now. The exchange was interrupted by Dr. Wilson, who reminded Eleanor that Samuel needed another dose of medicine. The twins were carefully transferred to a tent that had been prepared for them where the doctor could monitor Samuel's condition through the night. Eleanor found herself welcomed back into the larger community with genuine warmth. The Washburn sisters were immediately absorbed into a group of older women sharing a large fire. The Petersons and Jensens reunited with friends from the main train, exchanging stories of their separate journeys. As night fell over the camp, Eleanor sat beside the fire in the medical tent, watching over the sleeping twins. Samuel's breathing had eased considerably, and his fever had reduced to a mild warmth. Joshua slept beside his brother, one tiny hand resting against Samuel's, as if to reassure himself of his twins' presence. Gabriel Winters entered quietly, carrying 2 tin cups of hot coffee. He handed one to Eleanor before settling beside her. How is he? He asked, nodding toward Samuel. Much improved. Dr. Wilson says the worst has passed. Good. Gabriel sipped his coffee, his gaze moving from the twins to Eleanor's face. And you, how are you after everything that's happened? Eleanor considered the question seriously. The past weeks had been a crucible, testing her in ways she could never have imagined when she left St. Louis. She had faced blizzards, wagon accidents, illness, and the constant challenge of caring for 2 newborns in the wilderness. She had lost almost everything she owned and had been threatened with separation from the children she had come to love as her own, had nearly watched one of those children die. Yet sitting here now with the twins sleeping peacefully and Gabriel Winters beside her, Eleanor felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years, perhaps ever. I'm where I'm meant to be, she answered simply, with Samuel and Joshua, and with you if that's still what you want. Gabriel's expression softened. It is, more than anything. Then when we reach Oregon, Eleanor said, making the decision that had been forming in her heart for weeks, we'll build that home together, for all 4 of us. Gabriel reached out, taking her hand in his. This time the touch wasn't fleeting, but a deliberate connection, a promise for the future they would build together. Outside, the first stars appeared in the clear night sky, winter bright and steadfast. The worst of their journey was behind them now, with only the final descent to the Oregon valleys ahead. There would be challenges still establishing a new life in a frontier territory, building a medical practice, raising twin boys to adulthood. But Eleanor faced these prospects without fear. She had survived the storm literally and figuratively. And in doing so, she had found not just the fresh start she had sought when leaving St. Louis, but a new family formed in the crucible of shared struggle and mutual care. As Samuel stirred in his sleep, making the small, contented sounds that had become so precious to her, Eleanor felt a deep gratitude for the twisting path that had led her here. The journey had been more difficult than she could have imagined, but the destination, this moment with these people, was worth every hardship endured along the way. Gabriel squeezed her hand gently as if reading her thoughts. We made it, he said simply. Yes, Eleanor agreed, looking at the sleeping twins and then at the man beside her. We made it. Together. And in that word together lay all the promise of the future awaiting them in Oregon territory, a future built on the foundation of love that had carried them through the storm.